Dear guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you, the audience here in the University Aula in Bergen, Norway, as well as the viewers around the world, to the Holberg Debate 2024. My name is Jørgen Sejersted, and I am the chair of the board of the Holberg Prize. The Holberg Prize is one of the largest international prizes awarded to outstanding scholars in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. The prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 in homage to the 18th century scholar and writer Ludvig Holberg. In addition to the academic events that are held in June each year in celebration of the Holberg Prize laureate, the Holberg Debate is held annually in December in the spirit of the intellectual curiosity and societal engagement of Ludvig Holberg. The Holberg Debate aims to engage prominent scholars as well as non-academics in public debate on pressing issues of our time. The title of this year's debate is the question, is the West in decline? On the panel, we are very proud to present Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss, Professor Yanis Varoufakis, and author-commentator Constantine Kisin. They will all be properly introduced shortly. But for now, let me extend a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming here to Bergen. We are also very pleased indeed to have with us British journalist Sarah Montague as moderator of this event. Sarah Montague has presented many of the BBC's most popular radio and TV programs, including Hard Talk, Today, and The World at One. Before joining the BBC, Montague worked at Reuters Television and Sky News. Over a number of years, she also presented BBC World's Noble Minds, a discussion between Nobel laureates on global issues. Montague holds the honorary degrees Doctor of Letters from the University of Sussex and Doctor of Laws from the University of Bristol. We are truly honored to have you with us. So please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Jørgen, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Holberg Debate. It is a privilege to be moderating the debate here today at the university in the beautiful city of Bergen. Not only because we have a stellar cast, but the subject is one that is central to all our futures, is the West in decline. Now, if we're only talking about relative decline because other parts of the world are becoming richer and ideally more democratic, then perhaps we could be happy about that. But if decline means that we become poorer, our democracies are under threat, our culture is eroded, and our choices for how we want to live our lives are limited, then I suspect we'd all want to find ways to address that. And I'm assuming, of course, that as we're debating here in Bergen, that we, for the purpose of our debate, are Western. Now, you'll know that we're considering this question because of the obvious pressures and crises that are facing the Western world. Take living standards. No longer the case that our children can expect to be wealthier than us, nor indeed live longer than us. Take the rise of China and its lending support to Russia and other BRIC nations. In a multipolar world, what happens to Western influence? Take the pressure on our democracies from populism, disinformation, and social fragmentation. The leader of the free world, the USA, is deeply divided. And love him or hate him, we are buckling up for the roller coaster ride that will be the second Trump presidency. Or take war in the Middle East, famine in Sudan, the invasion of Ukraine, all of which the West seems unable or unwilling to prevent. Not to mention, of course, we seem increasingly damaged by the warming planet, which, if we can't address, could accelerate any decline. It's a rather terrifying list. But, and there are some really significant buts in this debate, there are some remarkable positives. People are now better educated. We live in remarkably innovative societies at a time of rapid technological change. And democracy has been a remarkably resilient system. And of course, if your fear is a physical threat, then Western nations are now rapidly raising their defense spending. That's the backdrop. Let's get going on the debate itself. Now, I should say that if you want to be more directly involved in this debate, you can do. You can go to the website holbergprize.org and send a question in. I shall be casting my eye across them and feeding them into the debate, perhaps picking up a few at the end. And that debate will start shortly, but first we are going to have some presentations from each of our panelists. So let me introduce them, all three of them first, then we'll get them one by one up on the stage. Yanis Varoufakis almost needs no introduction. Leads Mera25 in Greece, co-founder of the pan-European movement DM25. He's an academic economist. He was Greece's finance minister in 2015 when he sort of burst onto the global stage. Absolutely brilliant interviewee, always good fun to interview. Author of best-selling books, among them Techno-Feudalism, Talking to My Daughter, and The Weak Suffer What They Must. He, of course, is the undoubted left-winger on our panel. Constantine Kisin became famous for his defense of free speech. He's a Sunday Times best-selling author, comedian, satirist, social commentator, and of course, host of Trigonometry. Born in the Soviet Union, raised in Britain, he wrote An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, and he's talked widely on topics such as tolerance, cancel culture, immigration, and multiculturalism. And finally, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, professor in the School of Public Affairs and School of Education at the American University in Washington. Much of her research is around the prevention of hate-fueled violence, which is why she was involved in founding, well, what's called PERIL. It's the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. She's testified regularly in front of the US Congress and written books, among them, perhaps most famous, Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. So let's start with Cynthia. Would you like to take the stage, Cynthia? The floor is yours for a while, and then I'll hop back up.
Thank you. Thank you all. I want to thank the Holberg Prize Committee, the organization for hosting us, for having us, the university for having us here, my fellow panelists for whom it's a real honor for me to be on the stage with you both, and Sarah for moderating this debate as well. I thought, since I go first, I might start with a bit of a definition of what the West is, since I know some questions exist about that. How do we define it? How do we understand it? We may not all agree on that. To some extent, it's usually used to refer geographically to Western Europe, North America, New Zealand, Australia. But then, of course, there's contested countries that straddle Eastern Europe, Turkey, Mexico, sometimes referred to as part of the West as well, sometimes not, because they fit in other regions. But I think what we're really here to debate today is not the geography, but what's usually associated with those geographies, which are something sort of distinct culturally, politically, economically, a set of norms, values, and principles that have historically included things like democracy, I'm sure we'll talk about that, capitalism, I know we'll talk about that, individualism, liberty, equality, the safeguarding of human rights, the belief in scientific or rational knowledge over superstition and conspiracies, which is what I will focus on today, and the protection of the rule of law. All of that, in theory, has been guided by a Western principle of universalism, which means that all those ideals, individualism, liberty, equality, and human rights, are supposed to apply to everyone, all human beings without exception. But of course, that's the rub. that principle of universalism, the one that should be a liberating and equalizing force, has also helped perpetuate some of the most vile hierarchies of superiority and inferiority and human rights abuses in history, as Western explorers, leaders, and powers have sought to control, exploit, and conquer huge swaths of the globe in the name of a supposedly universally preferable and superior system. I'm not saying that other civilizations or regions of the world have not done horrific things. They have. The abuses of slavery, conquests, wars, genocides, the brutality of patriarchy itself is by no means a Western innovation or an exception. But the messianic colonialist effort to spread its principles and norms universally, often through force, is a distinguishing feature of the West, even if it's not a unique one. And the increasing backlash we've seen within Western democracies against minorities and women who are simply asserting their claims to those universal rights and principles, their ability to participate in it. Backlash in the form of rising hate crimes, white supremacist extremism, the kinds of things that I study, spikes in misogyny, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate, and in the form of a dismissal of complaints from minorities and women, that those complaints come from overly woke, triggered snowflakes who don't know real hardships, dismissals that notably almost always come from white men, is striking. And it raises the question of whether those principles and norms were ever really intended to be universal. Or were they simply a fig leaf used to justify colonial expansion and external pillaging and internal hierarchies that secured the dominance of white men? The growing disillusionment of those inside and outside the West who look at these contradictions and see at best a set of founding principles and norms that have gone awry, and at worst, ones that are working as intended, is understandably intense. So I would argue that it's the West's inability to reconcile those contradictions, the incomplete fulfillment of so many promises of liberty and equality, the tension between universalism's ambitions and its reality, that's left us so vulnerable to the multiple threats we face today, most of which I think come from within, and I suspect we're going to hear that from my fellow panelists too. So is the West thus defined in decline? And if so, is it reversible? To answer the first question, by all accounts, it's pretty clear that the West is in decline, or at the very least is in the midst of a protracted existential crisis. No democracy across the West could currently be described as thriving. We have rising authoritarianism, xenophobia, terrorist violence, conspiracy theories, the widespread rejection of science and authority, anti-government mobilization, and horrific inequality in place across the West. To take my own country as an example, a country that likes to refer to itself as the longest continuous democracy and the so-called leader of the free world, we landed on a list of backsliding democracies 3 years ago because of declining civil liberties, challenges to free speech and right of association, challenges to election integrity and trust in elections, and runaway polarization. But it's not just democracy that's failing in the West, and this is really what I want to talk about today, because communities and families are struggling too in a backsliding on social well-being. Social connection to and trust in others has been declining for decades. 50 years ago, nearly half of Americans reported feeling that they could trust fellow citizens. That's less than a third today. Polarization is at near historic highs. We have rising numbers of people diagnosed with depression and a rising use of antidepressants, with particularly striking data coming from the UK, but also across other Western countries, along with spikes in suicide rates, deaths of despair, which are overdoses, alcohol-fueled deaths, reports of isolation and depression and anxiety, especially for men and boys. And perhaps ironically, on that point, the West's insistence on a rigid gender binary and strict rules for masculine and feminine behavior exacerbates those trends. So out of Switzerland, we have new data showing that men who strongly adhere to traditional masculine ideals around suppressing their emotions and refusing to be vulnerable are twice as likely to attempt suicide as other men. It doesn't help that people spend less and less time in the company of other human beings. And that's worse for 15 to 24-year-olds who spend 70% less time in person today with friends than they did 2 decades ago. That's particularly meaningful given that the strength of adolescent friendships predicts a whole host of well-being measures into adulthood, from healthy romantic relationships to lower anxiety, aggression, and improved adult mental health overall. It's that last point where I want to spend the rest of my time today on how our unrelentingly online lives are undermining not only our social well-being, but our democracies themselves. If the West is headed for collapse, I will argue, it will be in no small part at the hands of the crisis of information that online ecosystems have introduced, including widespread and unrelenting exposure to, and increasing beliefs in conspiracy theories, propaganda, mis, and malinformation, and the rejection of science, academic expertise, and traditional sources of knowledge and information, including the media. So disinformation and conspiracy theories are powerful mobilizers of mass violence, including some of the worst examples of anti-democratic violence we've seen in recent history. The US Capitol attackers were so far down disinformation rabbit holes that they fervently believed they were the courageous revolutionary actors who were saving democracy. Similar momentum mobilized the storming of the German parliament just a few months earlier, and an attack on the Canadian Prime Minister's residence by an armed conspiracy theorist just weeks before that. Conspiracy theories about a great replacement or Eurabia have mobilized terrorist actors right here in Norway, in Germany, in New Zealand, across the US, and elsewhere. It's hard to overstate the ease with which ordinary people have embraced harmful online content in a wide variety of range of categories: conspiracy theories, propaganda, disinformation, just to name three. So there's several ways this has evolved, I would argue, into a crisis from which we might not return, and I just want to touch on three here. First, we're on the heels of a successful, decades-long campaign by the conservative and far right across the West to attack mainstream expertise in general and higher educational institutions in particular as bastions of leftist brainwashing that seek to undermine and dismantle Western societies from within. Let's be clear, professors do skew left. But there's plentiful evidence showing that liberal professors do not produce more liberal students. There's no mass brainwashing effort on campus. There's no global project to use universities as a tool of thought control in the so-called cultural Marxist revolution, which is a conspiracy theory that puts universities at the helm of an orchestrated effort by global communists to overthrow capitalist and Western societies from the inside. Once a fringe conspiracy theory, the phrase cultural Marxism edged its way into the mainstream as part of a set of arguments that warn the left is trying to destroy Western society through things like feminism, a disrupted gender binary, multiculturalism, Muslim immigration, and gay rights, which will supposedly undermine the West, the nation, capitalism, and traditional Judeo-Christian values all at once. Putting universities at the center of this plot made higher education the predominant site of the culture wars that the conservative and far right have claimed are undermining Western civilization. In and of itself, I wouldn't see that as particularly problematic. We can debate those issues all you want, and I'm sure we will today. But years of attacks on higher education that now increasingly take place within an online ecosystem that offers plenty of alternative facts as sources of information have done real damage. The far right's attacks on higher education ultimately anchored a broad assault on specialized knowledge and expertise more generally in ways that have undermined the credibility of expert scholars, facts, and arguments. Public health experts, the free press, scientists, and others have increasingly become suspect, accused of partisan bias, or disregarded entirely. The overall effect has been a weakening of the legitimacy of sources of knowledge and trust in the kinds of expertise that have historically helped build shared ways of explaining and understanding our worlds. The consequences of this, from anti-vax movements that have broad public health consequences, to lost trust in the courts, vulnerability to disinformation about stolen elections, are clear. By undermining the public's sources of factual information, attacks on higher education and expertise have created broader receptivity to propaganda and conspiracy theories. Second, this is all made worse by the fact that we spend most of our time now, or much of our days, in an online ecosystem that's vast and ever-expanding and full of harmful content, including massive amounts of fake and false and disinformation content that are sometimes hard to distinguish from reality, including because of AI-generated images and videos that are realistic enough to fool expert analysts, let alone ordinary citizens. Added to that is the problem that most people now get their news not from traditional media, but from social media, which has created immense risks as disinformation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories spread quickly online. Not least because even in the best of circumstances, tech companies' trust and safety policies are necessarily reactive. They're a Band-Aid solution focused on content moderation and removal of harmful information that's often been viewed and downloaded millions and millions of times before removal, and then is easily uploaded and shared again on mainstream and dark web platforms alike. And we've seen that with terrorist livestream videos over the past several years. Perhaps even worse, algorithmic recommendations actually feed harmful content directly to users even when they're not searching for it. An Australian study recently replicated in Ireland found that teenage boys' accounts encounter toxic male supremacist content within minutes on YouTube Shorts and TikTok, even when they're not looking for it, and that if an account shows any interest by watching that content, within 2 to 3 hours, the vast majority of content that is recommended to them is anti-feminist, misogynistic, and male supremacist. That content comes to boys and men no matter what they do. In particular, wherever they are online, subtly and not so subtly shaping their views of gender, hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, and ideas about power, control, and the acceptability of violence. Third, and finally, and I won't have time to get into this, but maybe we will in discussion, our time in those online ecosystems is even riskier, it's worth saying, because of fake news and disinformation that's propagated by hostile foreign actors intending to disrupt the West, further polarize us, and explicitly weaken kind of social cohesion and trust across identities. And so a new EU report on foreign interference, for example, that I just read, has documented systematic meddling in elections and interference in democratic elections across the EU, and points to the need for more proactive measures to address it, but it's really just sort of scratching the surface. So what can we do about this? I promise I'm not going to leave you with just the bad news, but I'm not going to come back to the good news until the very end. So we have 3 minutes at the end to wrap up, and I'm going to tell you about what works to prevent people from going down these rabbit holes, and that is the good news. We do have really good evidence that it can be prevented. The question is do we have time to prevent it further? But for now, I'll just wrap up to say, to sum up, my answer to the framing question is yes. The West is in decline, and my argument to justify that answer is that this decline is rooted in large part in a crisis in how we encounter, receive, and evaluate information in an increasingly online world. Attacks on higher education and specialized expertise, including in the media, combined with relentless exposure to bad, false, harmful, and fake content online, has weakened the legitimacy of what are supposed to be our most trusted sources of knowledge and expertise. And this means we now lack shared ways of explaining, interpreting, and understanding our worlds in ways that have led far too many people to readily accept conspiracy theories, scapegoating, fear-mongering, and other authoritarian tactics that stoke violence and erode democracies across the West and around the world. So I will return at the end to the good news about ways to prevent people from being persuaded by harmful and manipulative content, including at scale from recent evidence. But for now, I really want to hear what my colleagues have to say.
There is going to be so much to dive into here. Let's get our next speaker up, Yanis Varoufakis.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the Holberg Prize for giving me an opportunity to engage with the question. So, is the West in decline? Most definitely not. But don't get your hopes high. This is no reason to rejoice. especially if you treasure, as I do, the values that have come to be espoused by the West over the last 50, 60, 70 years. Now, who is it that is truly worried and has surrendered to the thought that the West is declining? Starting from this continent, a motley of European conservatives, centrists, leftists, beyond Europe, intellectuals from the global south, and more recently, after their recent trouncing in the hands of a resurgent Donald Trump, US Democrats. I think they're all wrong. Never before has so much power been concentrated in the hands of so few, both persons and postcodes, in the West. So why all this navel-gazing in the West? Why have so many good people in the West and beyond the West, around the world, surrendered themselves to this conviction or feeling that the West is fading, it is declining? In Europe, there is good cause. Just as the Roman Empire had to shift its capital from Rome to Constantinople in order to gain another 1,000 years of hegemony, so too, the center of the West's gravity shifted from Britain and Europe to the United States of America in exactly the same way that Emperor Constantine effectively surrendered or abandoned Rome to the barbarians. Europe, too, has been abandoned to the forces of stagnation, which are rendering, as we speak, the European Union inert, backward, and increasingly irrelevant. But there is a second reason. One is Eurocentric. It is the reason, I just mentioned it, why the European bourgeoisie is in such a state of moral panic, so eager to confuse its own decline for the decline of the West. But the second reason is far more delicious, and it is a paradox. Like a snake sheds old skin, the West has shed its own value system over the last few decades. A value system which was utterly necessary to the West to maintain its ascendancy during the 20th century, which, however, during the 21st century, is surplus to requirements. It is holding the West's triumphant march back. If you think about this from the perspective of, the manner in which the West rose up. How did the West rise up? In precisely the same way that capitalism did not need democracy in order to rise. It is a mistake to think that democracy is a prerequisite for capitalism. There was no democracy in the 18th and 19th centuries. In Europe, there's no democracy in China, and you have a capitalist explosion in China. Similarly, the Western value system was not functional to the rise of the West. Indeed, precisely the opposite. It was brutal exploitation at home, along with the opium trade, the slave trade, and a number of genocides in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, which created the power base of the West. We had that already from Cynthia. That was the foundation for the great trading empires. The Dutch Empire, the British Empire, the French, the Portuguese. That was the foundation. Come to think of it, the great mansions, the estates, the magnificent opera houses and museums, like this one, were initially founded not on wishy-washy principles like, the rule of law, or equality before the law, or democracy, or human solidarity. They were founded on sheer, brutal, naked exploitation and extraction. So, what is the origin of the Western value system that I personally treasure, and which, in the end, was espoused and embraced by most of us in the West? What is the origin of that? Well, for a long, long while, the power of the West outside the strict borders and confines of the West was unassailable. Europe sent millions of usually armed colonists to the four corners of the world. They, as I said, they extracted and they subjugated. They took one look at natives and chose not to see them as human beings, deciding that, or declaring that their land was terra nullius, a land without a people for settlers craving that particular land. The first move in every genocide, whether it happened in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, or in today's Palestine. But however unassailable the power of the West was outside the West, at home, Western power met very significant resistance, substantial challenges, primarily from its own wretched working classes, but also from the petty bourgeoisie. Western power was shaken by economic crises at the home front, which were primarily due to the fact that the many were too impecunious to be able to afford the products that they were producing in the factories of the few. These tensions spilled over into massive industrial strength wars between Western powers. Western powers competing for market share, some called it vital space, culminating into two lethal world wars. These, let's call them setbacks, forced the powers that be in the West to make concessions. Domestically, we know what form the concessions took. They took the form of more democratization, of health systems, public health systems, of social security, of pensions. But internationally, the outrage at the lethality of the Western wars, the Western civil wars within the West, as well as the genocides, especially after the Second World War, led to the scripting of universal declarations of human rights, of the UN Charter, of even the foundation of international courts of justice and international criminal courts. For 2 decades after the Second World War, at least 2 decades, maybe a little bit more, the West basked in the warm glow of the Western value system that we had created after World War II. It was a magnificent period. And it coincided with the shift of the Western center of gravity from Europe to the United States. And it was a period, the 1950s and 1960s, during which we created, well, the West created, or to be more precise, the United States created, an audacious, magnificent, globally planned, centrally planned, international monetary system known as the Bretton Woods system, which allowed the United States to recycle its own surpluses in Europe and in Japan, effectively guaranteeing its own net exports to Europe and to Japan by dollarizing America's allies. But then 1971 comes, the 15th of August, the Nixon shock. And all bets are off. What had happened, of course, was that the United States had become a deficit country. But instead of tightening its belt, Washington, D.C., the powers that be in Washington, instead of doing that which Germany would do, or impose on everybody else to do, which is austerity, tightening belts, to eliminate the deficit, they did exactly the opposite. They said, okay, now we are a deficit country. Now we have a 2-3% trade deficit of GDP. So what are we going to do? We're going to step on the accelerator and max out the trade deficit. This is precisely what has been happening since 1971. And it was not an accident. It was a wild beauty to behold, because this expanding trade deficit of the United States started functioning like a gigantic vacuum cleaner that was sucking out of Germany, Japan, later China, the net exports of those factories, of their factories, into the United States. And what did the German, the Japanese, the Indonesian, the Vietnamese, and of course, ultimately, the Chinese capitalists do with all the dollars that they were receiving for all the stuff that they were exporting to the United States? What can you do with these torrents of dollars? But take them back to New York City and to Wall Street. To do what? To buy US treasuries. In other words, think about this. This is remarkable. This is the first time in human history that the hegemon gets stronger the more into the red its trade and government budget balance goes. This has never happened before. Every other hegemon who went into the red collapsed. The United States became stronger as a result of expanding, of the burgeoning trade deficit. Because the trade deficit, through this recycling system, through the capitalist profits outside the United States, which is then brought back to Wall Street, and they use this money to fund the American government, which can then afford not to tax the rich or the middle class to the level that we tax the rich and the middle class in Europe. They could afford to have an army that has bases in 170 countries. And what else did the foreign capitalists do with the money that they brought to Wall Street? Well, they bought real estate, to the great joy of the Donald Trump types. And they bought a few shares, whatever shares the American authorities allowed foreigners to purchase, usually in second-rate companies, because of protectionism. Yeah? Now, at some point, the ruling class in the United States had an epiphany. Since we're trusting the foreign capitalists to send their dollars back to us, why don't we trust them to send the manufacturers back to us? So why don't we export whole production lines to Vietnam, to China, to Indonesia, to India, to all sorts of places? And that is the cause of the deindustrialization. Now, for this recycling mechanism to work, remember, Wall Street is at the heart of it. This is why you had deregulation of Wall Street under the Clinton administration. Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, the usual handmaidens of Wall Street. And of course, to deregulate, to bin all the great regulations, the Glass-Steagall Act, all the remnants of the magnificence of what was the New Deal once and the Bretton Woods system, you need an ideology. You need a cloak of respectability. You need a theory, a political economy. Thus, the rise of what is called neoliberalism, which, by the way, is neither new nor liberal. With this cloak of respectability and the political philosophy and political economy and helpful handmaidens in government, I mentioned, Larry Summers and the rest, Wall Street was allowed to go gangbusters. They minted mountain ranges of derivatives on the back of the tsunami of capital that was coming from Europe, from Japan, later from China, into the books of the Wall Street bankers. Do you remember the Brothers Grimm story featuring a pot which apparently incessantly produces whatever its owner commanded it to? And do you remember how, the moral of the story, how it ends? The village is flooded with porridge. Well, this is exactly what Wall Street did. It flooded the West's financial circuits with these Amazons of what Warren Buffett so aptly described as weapons of mass financial destruction, which at some point self-ignited in 2007 and exploded in 2008. And then, immediately, in a state of utter panic, the great and good leaders of the West gathered in London in April 2009, under the auspices and the chairmanship of a certain Mr. Gordon Brown. And what they decided to do was to save the financiers by printing, and then printing some more. Between then and today, they printed $35,000 billion on behalf of the financiers. That's 35 trillion. While at the same time practicing rather harsh austerity on their own populations. So you have socialism for the financiers and austerity, harsh austerity for the demos. The result? Grand celebrations in the leafy suburbs and, of course, the gated communities where the haves hide from the have-nots. This is the process by which the West jettisoned its values. The only ones who invested a small part, or a large part, but in proportional terms, a small part, of the minted trillions was big tech. And that gave them the cloud capital with which they can now pollute our minds, control our minds, and control and poison the conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to finish by saying that the West is not declining. It is going, as I said, along with Wall Street, gangbusters. But it is shedding the value system. As we are moving towards the natural, mathematical, logical conclusion of this process, I'm very much afraid that the West is not going to end with a whimper, but it will most probably end with a bang, given the escalating new Cold War with China, a bang after which I don't think China or anyone else or any other bloc is going to dominate, but rather we are going to be in a kind of post-apocalyptic aftermath where the Mad Max movies will be a sort of a documentary. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm looking forward to this debate. Trust Yanis to throw another sort of bomb in. Goodness, what a coherent path we're going to try to challenge, to weave, after we've heard from our final speaker, Constantine Kisin.
I'm going to stand behind the podium, otherwise I feel I'll blend into the chairs with my suit. It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure it is to have been invited. And of course, it's wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Bergen, one of the very few places in the world where the weather is even worse than London. It's great to be here. I'm afraid, being British, I will begin with an apology. Unlike our distinguished speakers, I'm not a professor of anything, and unlike Yanis, I've never been charged with saving the Greek economy from collapse, a task whose achievability I regard with some skepticism. But the one thing I can offer, perhaps, is that I have a very different perspective on things to most Westerners, despite being one. I am both an insider and an outsider. I was born in the Soviet Union and grew up there, and then early 1990s Russia, before moving to England as a teenager. And being Russian, I must also begin with a warning, I'm afraid. Many of you will be familiar with the story of the boiling frog, a frog that sits in water that gets increasingly warmer without noticing the frog is cooked. Well, those of us who come from Eastern Europe have been cooked before. And my warning is that it's getting really hot in here, I'm afraid. So, by the way, I loved Yanis's present, and Cynthia's too, of course, but Yanis's present, I mean, if he's arguing that the West is not in decline, I'm really terrified of what decline is going to look like by comparison. Now, the subject of tonight's debate is whether the West is in decline, but to answer it, I must address an obvious question, at least to me, that sits underneath this entire discussion, which is the fact that many people in our societies, including many intellectuals, journalists, and academics, would like our society to be in decline, because it validates the worldview that they have of the rich imperial white colonialists who must be finally stripped of their ill-gotten gains of the kind that we've just heard described on stage. And I say that this sits underneath our discussion because once a society has sufficiently imbibed this mind virus, it is inevitably going to question its own survival. If enough people believe that their society is bad, how could they not bring about its decline? Now, let me be clear. I don't think decline is inevitable. On the contrary, I think it's extremely avoidable. We just have to choose to avoid it. And my warning is not intended to provoke paralysis. It's intended to provoke action. Incidentally, before we go on, the question about whether the West is good and worth preserving has an easy, obvious, and uncontestable answer. That answer is Australia. Australia is a Western country in a non-Western part of the world, surrounded by non-Western countries. I was there earlier this year. And in Australia, there are precisely 0 people who get onto rickety boats every year to brave shark-infested waters in search of a better life elsewhere. 0 people. The traffic is all one way, in the opposite direction. The same is true on the southern border of the United States. The same is true in the Mediterranean. The same is true in the English Channel, where tens of thousands of people cross over from Calais into Britain illegally every year. And I'm not blaming the people. I wouldn't want to stay in France either. My point is, if you look at how people vote with their feet, Western civilization blows the competition out of the water. I know this is politically incorrect to say nowadays, but our civilization is better. I know you don't like to hear it, but it is. That's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of millions of people who come every year, and the hundreds of millions who would if they could. And that is despite the fact that we are undoubtedly going through a period of decline. Now, what do I mean by decline? I think we do owe an explanation and a definition, and each of us probably has our own. In 1978, my countryman Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had just left the Soviet Union after many years in the gulags, came to the United States and gave an address to the Harvard students on their commencement address. And here's what he said. Let me quote him briefly. "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and intellectual bureaucrats show depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, and intellectually, and even morally warranted it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. And decline in courage is ironically emphasized by occasional explosions of anger and inflexibility on the part of those same bureaucrats when dealing with weak governments and weak countries not supported by anyone, or with currents which cannot offer any resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Should one point out that from ancient times, decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end? I'm sad to say that his message has aged excruciatingly well. Not only is it still true, it's more true today than it was 50 years ago. But forget Solzhenitsyn. How about we listen to our fellow citizens? In Britain, 68% of people, when polled in a recent Ipsos poll, said that Britain is in decline. Why do British people feel this way? Well, we're inherently miserable. That's part of it, but in case it's just not the only explanation, let's look at the facts. In Britain, GDP per capita fell very sharply in 2007 during the financial crisis, and has still not recovered. Put simply, on average, British people are poorer today than they were in 2007. And I'm afraid to say, this is true here in Norway too. It's true in Sweden, in Iceland, in Finland, in France, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and in Ireland. I'm afraid it's true in Greece, where the GDP fell from $32,000 in 2008 to just $23,000 today. And this is not an accident. Because politicians are judged on whether they grow GDP, not GDP per capita, they don't actually care about whether we are getting richer or poorer. The easiest way to deliver GDP growth is to increase the number of bodies in the country, the number of people. That's the way you do it. And the way they've done it, by importing low-skill, low-wage people from other parts of the world, has made us poorer in a way that we can't blame them for it. Economic growth in Britain is not just anemic, it's fake. It's an accounting trick. As for Europe, it's been an economic decline for at least a decade. That's not me telling you that or Yanis telling you that. Those are the words of José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission, writing earlier this week. Now look, money isn't everything. It can't buy you happiness, although it can buy you cars with heated seats, which is the closest thing to happiness that I've discovered in Norway. But the absence of money does make misery a lot more probable. I'm going to talk about Britain for a moment, but wherever you've come from or wherever you're watching this on the internet, see if this rings a bell. We release dangerous criminals from prison because of overcrowding. The police do not investigate crimes like burglaries and car breaks. We have growing NHS waiting lists, and even the anger we saw spill out on the streets of Britain during the summer is in large part a product of a stagnating economy. The average age for somebody buying their first apartment or house in Britain is 34. In London, where all the good jobs are, it's 37, which means that even the small fraction of our young people who can afford to buy their own house will probably do it when it's too late for them to have children for purely biological reasons. And while expensive housing and a stagnating economy are not the only explanation for this, they are a significant contributor to the fact that Britain's total fertility rate has fallen massively in the last 60 years. In 1964, the average British woman had 3 children. Today, we are way below replacement. As with other troubles of this kind, Britain is not alone. From the US to the entire European Union to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, we are not even close to having enough children. This is not a uniquely Western phenomenon, but it is particularly bad in the West. Now look, I don't claim to know what the right number of human beings on planet Earth is. And when I spend an hour on doom scrolling on social media, I increasingly think that number is 0. But what I do know is that if you were a zoologist studying an animal species which was failing to reproduce, you would hardly conclude that everything is going swimmingly. Have you ever heard the expression, it's like getting pandas to mate? It's used to say that something is very difficult because zoos and conservationists are struggling to maintain the panda population. Well, the average female panda will have 5 to 6 children over the course of her lifetime. The average Western female human will have 1.5. This phenomenon has cultural, economic, and even spiritual dimensions. But the fact is that a society which is not having enough children to replace its population is not only doomed to decline, it's also doomed to the mass, uncontrolled immigration of the kind that the entire Western world has seen in recent years. And the reason I bring up mass immigration is that a nation can endure and bounce back from periods of stagnation and even decline, provided there's a sense of common purpose and a willingness to be honest about the problems that society faces. In Britain, we have neither. The nation and the common purpose that came with it is rapidly becoming a thing of the past, to be replaced by the much celebrated communities we hear so much about. Instead of seeing ourselves as British first and everything else second, we increasingly see ourselves as Asian, black, white, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, LGBTQI+ first, and little else second. As for honesty, well, we shun, ostracize, and in Britain increasingly set the police on people who express widely held views about illegal immigration, Islamist terrorism, and the failure of multiculturalism. Especially if they come from the working class, whose crass ways and ugly sentiments offend the chattering classes. And yet, despite all of this, I see no urgency. When I listen to the people who run my country, of all political persuasions, they all think that this is normal, a problem to be managed. I assumed this was the case, that they were putting this face on for public consumption, but I'm afraid behind closed doors, they're all exactly the same. And people say that if we were attacked, we'd struggle to get people to enlist. I think that's complete nonsense. I think if we suffered what the people of Ukraine have suffered, or what the people of Israel suffered on October 7th, there would be millions of people in our countries that would rise to defend it, and millions of others to support the war effort. But the problem is, we're not in a war. There is no enemy to fight. And so nobody knows what to do, which is why what we have is just a creeping, unstoppable malaise. Even now, with the wave of enthusiasm that has swept Argentina and the United States, because the problem is not our politicians, it's us. Milei won in Argentina because he promised to cut red tape, taxes, and bureaucrats with his chainsaw of freedom. Trump won in America because he promised to cut regulation, taxes, and waste. Europeans, on the other hand, are very clear. We want higher taxes and more government. This is why no politician in Britain or in Europe talks about unleashing the talents of our people. We don't want to be unleashed. We want to be looked after. We need to recognize that the answer to our problems is to create a vibrant and growing economy, not to hike up tax rates and energy prices to chase industrial, creative, and wealthy people out of our countries. Britain, if you don't know, has lost more millionaires in recent years than any country in the world except China. We need to spend more time focusing on building wealth instead of arguing about how to divide it. We need to aspire to do things, to make things, to create things. I know that many of you don't like him, but if you're even remotely curious or intellectually honest, you have to ask yourself, why has Elon Musk become an icon to hundreds of millions of people around the world? It's not his charismatic speeches and stunning good looks. It's the fact that he builds big things, and in doing so reminds us who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to reach for the stars, not into our neighbors' pockets. I know that to the British ear, and by the judging by your faces, also to the Norwegian ear, this sounds like immense cringe. I understand. I do. This mindset shift we need is going to be very difficult. It's like getting Westerners to mate. But I'm here to tell you something that you already know. Until we decide to become a civilization that wants to succeed, we will not. Thank you very much.
So, where to start with this? Yanis and Cynthia, come on stage. Constantine, do sit down. Thank you so much. I think I should start with what the ideal is. What is the dream? Because, in a way, the question is the West in decline is, and it will come on to whether, I mean, the very fact that we're asking this question when you think everyone wants the world to be in decline would suggest...
Not everyone.
Okay, well, come on to that. What I want to know, though, in a way, from a starting point, is what's the dream? Presumably, first of all, the dream is that other nations become wealthier.
Whose dream?
Sorry?
Whose dream are you asking us?
I'm asking each of your dreams.
Each of us.
I'm asking for you to paint, and it's a kind of naive idea because, of course, you know, it'll never happen. But let's just, if you could control things, would you want every other nation to become as wealthy as the West? Would you want them to become as democratic as the West? Yanis.
Oh, me?
Why not?
Well, allow me to answer by means of an example, which touches upon something Constantine said. That, you know, the riffraff out there, outside the West, are dying to come to our shores, and therefore it means that we're civilized and we're better. Well, take the Democratic Republic of Congo. The King of Belgium created a slave colony there for 30 years. Then it was taken over by the state of Belgium for 40 years. Then, as they were gaining independence, the CIA murdered their first president. And now today, Glencore, one of our great corporations, is mining all sorts of cobalt derivatives and so on, giving zero to the people of the Republic of Congo. I'd like to live in a West which is not a parasite on people that it then denigrates by saying that you are the riffraff and you want to come to a beautiful garden and this is why, you know, and therefore our dream is to stop you from coming, which is your dream.
Okay, no, but in a way... But is the ultimate aim, I mean, if you could do it, that yes, you don't have whatever the mining companies doing whatever they do in other nations, but those nations build up. I'm just wondering if the dream is a multipolar world.
Well, very briefly, the dream is to have cooperation, solidarity, and genuine development of everyone that lives on this planet.
And the land of milk and honey, too. We must have that.
So, Constantine, is that what you would also say?
Well, we only have an hour and 40 minutes, so let me be brief.
The multipolar world, is that something that you should say?
No, the multipolar world is an atrocious idea whose consequences will be exactly the consequences we have when you see a multipolar world within one country. That country is Mexico. Mexico is controlled by a large number of cartels. And when one of them is taken out, what ensues is a chaotic fight for dominance again. And the multipolar world will lead to conflagration, inevitably, because somebody has to be on top. It's unavoidable. And
somebody has to be on top.
Of course. You know, Yanis's point about cooperation is entirely wonderful, but the best way to predict human behavior is to look at human behavior in the past. When is this great age in which everyone just sat together?
So that is a good argument to bring back slavery, because almost every
since
society
we're on the subject of slavery, let me just
had slavery.
May I address what Yanis has said repeatedly, actually? I think it's important to do so. What he said on stage during his presentation is entirely true, which is that many of the riches of Western societies are the product of the resources that were taken from other parts of the world. What I'm afraid this analysis is missing is the fact that during that time, as during the present time, the entire world was competing on that very same model. The only reason that the European powers were able to be as effective as they were is that they had superior technology. And superior technology.
China had far more superior technology, and they were not imperialist.
May I finish? Yanis, 1 second. Okay. I will come to you to respond, but let's let Constantine make the point.
Let's be factually correct.
We've got an hour and 40. Well, we're good.
I think
it was only Europe that set out to destroy and to extract.
Right, we've only just started. Constantine.
It's too. I'm also slightly Greek, so this is a Greek on Greek violence here.
Get to the point, because otherwise...
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to need a little time to get to the point, especially if I'm interrupted. So, every other civilization in human history has practiced slavery in one form or another. Every other civilization, including the Native Americans, who were enslaving each other and anyone they could find, the Middle Eastern Arab slave trade across the Saharan desert was worse and lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade. And every other great empire in history attempted to practice slavery to the very best of its ability to do the very thing that Yanis rightly accuses Western powers of doing. Now, the reason the West was more successful at this is it was more technologically advanced and was able to transport people across oceans in a way that at that time no other civilization could. So yes, it is true that the Western history is one of colonialism and enslavement, but that is only because we were better at it than other people. That's the only reason that we are where we are.
So just to go, I will come to you in a minute, but just to go back to the specific question.
Yes.
Yeah. Should we be aiming towards a multipolar world? You would say, look, we're a competitive world. Let's just compete against everyone else.
I would say that the best world is a stable one. And the construction we have had for some time now has been one of the best periods in human history since the end of World War II. Now, why has that been?
For the West?
Well, I would argue for the billions of people around the world who've been lifted out of poverty during the same time, in addition to for the West. Now, is that maintainable? Well, that's, I think, the issue that we're in discussions about. I don't know if that's maintainable, but my argument, the argument I made, and the reason that we're having this debate about slavery, is that I consider Western values, I don't think we should bomb them into the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, as some of our leaders have been attempting to do. But they are the best values, at least for those of us who want to live in the West, and we should maintain them as much as we possibly can, and then other people may wish to buy into that worldview as well.
Okay, Cynthia, where are you on this?
Well, I think it's really important to point out that when you're talking about refugees at least, most refugees are not running towards something, they're running from something. I mean, we've sort of skipping the safety bit. And people want to be at home, right? People want to be home in their culture, in their language, with their family. We know that, and I think nobody wants to get into a rickety boat with their infant and cross and make a risky crossing. They're doing that because they have no choice but to do that. And I think if we want to change that pattern, you have to invest in regions of the world, safety, reduction of violence, reduction of gang. I mean, you look at what people are fleeing from, the kidnappings, the executions, the assaults, rapes in Central and South America, what people flee to the southern border, why they're doing that, I think, is also on us, to not pay attention to kind of investing in those regions.
Okay, so with an ultimate aim of a multipolar world.
I mean, I don't see any other alternative than a multipolar world, but you know, I also think that it's important to remember that nations have never been only one thing. They're constantly reimagined. They've always been reimagined, and perhaps they should be. So, you know, in Germany, where I spent many years doing research, you know, you look at the history books, the Huguenots showed up, and everybody, you know, is having a freak out about French, right? Like, there's always been immigration, migration, patterns of change, you know, you just look at the Germanic tribes, the Romans, right? I mean, these things, there've always been flows. So maybe we have to reimagine what it is to be a nation as well.
Okay, now, Yanis, I know I stopped you and it wasn't
No,
always
that's okay,
clear
you did
to
well.
But was there something...
There is too much testosterone on the stage between the two of us.
I don't know, the estrogen is trying to match it
It's a good
here.
thing you put me in the middle.
But was there something that you specifically objected to? I just wanted to give you a chance before I suspect the debate is going to...
Well, yes, I mean, factually, it's completely wrong. It's only the West that has created industrial-scale imperialism. If you look at the Arab lands, if you look at the Chinese had the technology, the Indians had the technology, the Indians had an industrial revolution before Britain, and they did not conquer the rest of the world. They did not do what the British and the Dutch and the French did. So it is, for me, just completely factually wrong, and therefore the conversation is not particularly interesting to say, oh, look, somebody would have transported, once they got the technology, you know, hundreds of millions of Africans to their place in order to create sugar plantations or, you know, cotton plantations. It's not true.
But that's
really
exactly what the Islamic world did. The Islamic world expanded from a tiny part of land to conquer all of southern Europe and all of North Africa.
But this is a fake history of the Islamic world.
Hold on a second. And not only that, to transport more Africans from sub-Saharan Africa into the Arab world than the Western powers collectively
did. Okay, look, we can't settle this now, but allow me to just make one point if I can, because of something else Constantine said. Look, the crisis of 2008 did deplete per capita incomes across the West, but for the reasons that I put forward, austerity for everyone, except for the financiers. It had nothing to do with migration. In your talk, you made it sound as if it was immigration that created the problems. No, immigration was utterly irrelevant to the crisis of 2008. It was the bankers that created that, and it was the combination of quantitative easing and austerity, which created some room for people to come in and fill the gaps.
Okay, pause.
May I just very briefly to say, I actually agree with Yanis about, I was not suggesting remotely that the immigration had caused the 2007 financial crash. What I was suggesting is our failure to recover is a product of the fact that our politicians bring in people who work for low wages to pretend GDP is growing when it's not. However, may I just address this point about refugees? First of all, most of the people who are coming on small boats are not coming with their infants. They're mostly young men. Number one. Number two, this idea that most of this immigration is based on the fleeing of war is just factually incorrect. Most people, including when they're asked, say that they're coming to the United States, for example, through the southern border, for a better life. And I would too, right? I would too. But countries need borders.
Okay. I was asking about a multipolar world, partly because I was just trying to think about, like, in a way, it's that thing about remove yourself from the close-up and just think what the dream is. But also, in a way, I was slightly surprised that none of you, I don't think, slightly Cynthia with you, saw that the threat to the West, such as it is, comes from external factors. Although I would just challenge, you said the West is not in decline, and then you had an apocalyptic picture in your final 30 seconds. Yes. You blew the world up.
That's exactly what I said. That the idea that the West will go out with a whimper, this is the decline, there's no evidence of that. The Western values are declining, but the power of the West, I made the point that never before has so much power been vested in the hands of so few people in the West. So this is the dialectical opposition. Our values are going down the toilet. Our power and wealth is going through the roof. And that is creating an inexorable path towards not a whimpering out, but towards either environmental catastrophe, You can see, COP28, COP29, we're not even talking about anymore environment. The Green Deal in Europe is gone. It's not funded anymore. Donald Trump comes out and says, drill, baby, drill. So we are heading towards a bang, not a whimpering out.
Okay, so if the question had been, is the West about to go, you would have said yes.
Well, no, the about means that will happen tomorrow. It may happen in 20 years. It may happen in 40 years. It may happen in 15 years. But there is, the question in this Holberg debate is about a steady decline. I don't see this in terms of our power and wealth.
I was momentarily reassured as you were presenting your thesis.
Yes.
And actually you end up in one of the most alarming places.
Good.
But like Constantine and Cynthia, you also put it down to internal, the threats.
Of course. The crisis of 2008 was a crisis of capitalism, of Western capitalism. It wasn't a crisis that was concocted in Russia, in China, in the Islamic world. It was the result of this audacious recycling system, which was a very funny combination of balance and disequilibrium, very precarious, and at some point, because Wall Street was given this exorbitant power, effectively to print private money for the bankers, the whole thing came crashing down, and then our leaders decided to not to do what South Korea did in 1998 or what Sweden and Finland did in 1992, which is to save the banks but not the bankers. They decided to save the bankers by printing so much money that essentially you created huge asset price inflation for the rich and you destroyed the prospects of the many with austerity. That is an internal crisis. It is a crisis which is endogenous, to put it in a quasi-scientific manner.
Okay, I just want to dive into something, though, about this sort of the potential external, and there's quite a number of questions on this. One makes the point, you critique the global financial system, and on this question of the West decline. Is the decline of the West really a decline of the global North, or is it more a matter of the global South gaining the space to assert alternative economic systems and values? Now, you didn't speak to that.
No,
but when you look at
chance.
what's happening with the BRICS and with China and India, do you see that as, well, if not a threat to the West, a competition for space?
No, absolutely, absolutely. What is happening is this. Look, if you look at the United States economy, which is the only Western economy that really matters, it is now at around 50% of the industrial production of China, in dollar terms, not in PPP terms. So already, manufacturing in the United States has declined precipitously. And the West, the global North, as you put it, is now shrinking in terms of global GDP. So you have the BRICS, you have Brazil, you have Russia, you have India, you have South Africa, you have also Indonesia, Malaysia. They are all absolutely peeved by the fact that even though their share of the global pie is increasing, they're all under the thumb of the Fed, of the Central Bank of the United States, in the sense that there is no payment that can take place around the world. A Malaysian cannot buy something from an Indonesian without this payment going somehow through the Fed. The Fed can stop a payment by an Indonesian to Malaysian. So they have this ambition of creating a parallel payment system, which is what the BRICS pays, and it's actually a very interesting thing. But that's not the same thing as a challenge to the US dollar, because the reason why BRICS is not going anywhere fast, even though it is an interesting experiment, is because China, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, they have not decided yet, to challenge the monopoly, the exorbitant power of the dollar. Why? Because if you're a Chinese capitalist, you make your money because of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. If you're selling aluminium to California, right, the United States is in a huge trade deficit. The only reason why they can buy aluminium from you is because they pay in the global currency, which is the dollar. So the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has not decided yet whether they want to challenge the dominance of the dollar. Because don't forget, they have $3 to $4 trillion worth of savings. It's like you trying to undermine the bank in which you have your savings. But the way that the United States is persecuting this new Cold War, especially after Biden, with the CHIPS Act, effectively told Beijing you're not going to be allowed to have a technologically advanced country or economy. They are pushing, the West is pushing, the United States is pushing the Chinese leadership to the point when they will turn BRICS into something that is substantial, like, for instance, a Bretton Woods with a one at its heart. But they have not decided that yet, because Chinese capitalists don't want it yet.
So when you look at the G20, you look at Saudi talking about joining the BRICS nations. I mean, I'm assuming people know Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Yes.
You just think, listen, this is all overstated, that the G7 is still...
Of course it is. Look, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they think as follows. They saw that after the war in Ukraine, the Fed and, effectively the Fed, along with the European Central Bank, but it was mainly the Fed, essentially grabbed $400 billion of Russian central bank money, okay? I'm not judging this, I'm just stating it. And if you are an Emirati, a sheikh, you know you're not the best person in the world. You know that, you have an interesting track record. And you think, yeah, well, they don't like Putin, they got his money, maybe tomorrow they'll get mine. So if you have 100 billion, right, you put a couple of those billions through the Chinese one-denominated cloud finance system, the digital payment system of the Central Bank of China, you hedge a little bit. Washington sees this as a mortal danger to its hegemony, because it's not its industry and it's not its competitiveness that keep America hegemonic. It is the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. The only thing, and this is the delicious irony, that the only thing that really, the greatest ally of the power of the dollar is the Chinese Communist Party, which has not decided yet to challenge it. They can challenge it, but then they will have to be hegemonic around the BRICS. And the Communist Party of China, unlike the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, does not want to be hegemonic. They just want to sell stuff.
Okay, but we're focusing it, understandably, in terms of China and the US. But when you look at other nations, India, for example, and
they want to buy cheap Russian petrol, gas, oil, paying in rupees.
Okay.
And the BRICS pay system allows them to do that.
But would it be fair to say that there are people in the global south, let's call it the global south, who look towards the West, see the G7, see the UK and France sitting on the Permanent Security Council, and think, this is not working for me?
Of course. Of course.
So do you think the UK and France should give up their seat on the... Oh,
I think it's preposterous that we have the relics of the Second World War representing, the international order. But nevertheless, what international order? We have an international criminal court, effectively trashed whenever one of our own bastards is indicted. But when the other side's bastards are indicted, we suddenly love it. We are such hypocrites.
Okay. Cynthia. In this multipolar world, do you think countries like France and the UK should be giving up their permanent seat to make it more democratic?
Well, I think we should at least reconsider the distribution of seats, distribution of power, especially because I think when you're looking at the kinds of things that security is affected by in terms of the information ecosystem, the scams, the AI technology that's used, the rapidity with which sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has moved to entirely mobile systems of banking and payment, right? We're not there, right, in the West. So we're not even, we need to be keyed into how the rest of the world is engaging and preventing some of the, sextortion scams, for example, that are targeting teenage boys across the West. And leading to, I think, in our country, 36 suicides last year that originate from outside the US in the global south. Those kinds of, we have a different level of security kinds of things that have to address what the roots are and what's going on in those parts of the world as well.
Okay, but would you be better able to do these things, which I know you think are fundamental to society, if you opened the doors more to where the power resides?
I do think so.
Yeah. Constantine, you were shaking your head.
I think all this talk about the West giving up its seats on the UN Security Council. I mean, look, there are many...
I didn't say the West. I said the UK and France, which, are like middling, relatively, middling powers, let's say.
I think this is all insane. Utterly insane.
Isn't it logical?
No, it's not logical. I come back to what I said before. The world is a competitive place. It's a battle of civilizations. And ultimately,
it's a very bleak view of it.
Ultimately, somebody is going to be on top. And the choice is...
Oh my God, this is the bully theory.
Yanis,
ultimately,
The one
you've
bully
got,
theory.
I'm going to come back to you. You have got plenty of time.
No, I just wanted to be provocative. I didn't
please,
have...
Yanis hasn't had enough talking time. Go ahead.
Please, Constantine.
Somebody is going to be on top, and it's either going to be us, or it's going to be Russia, or it's going to be China. And if you want Chinese communist values to be the dominant ones in the world, be my guest. If you want Vladimir Putin's values to be the dominant ones in the world, be my guest. But I grew up in a society which had that. My family live both in Russia and Ukraine, which are both suffering the effects of that. And I can tell you now, that would be the worst possible outcome for all of humanity.
But Constantine, you are arguing a different point.
No, I'm not.
My question was around this idea of what happens to the power at the top, and I'm talking about the why, and the perfect example in a way is the UK and France having the right of veto. Now, you are going, isn't there a danger that the Security Council loses any credibility because it no longer represents what the real world looks like?
The UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. I don't know what we're talking about. We're a very powerful country in the world, hugely still, despite the decline that we're in, and we should cling on to that for as long as we possibly can, for the reason that I gave you, which is a world in which Western values are the strongest ones, is a much better world than whatever alternative would be conceived of or created if that didn't happen.
Okay, so the representation, and I mean, it's really to illustrate a point of what we've got: US, France and the UK sitting there, China, Russia. Have I missed Canada, possibly? Or anyway, but that you think it's fine. We argue the case, leave it as it is. Yes. I mean, I suppose you could argue what value the UN Security Council has anyway.
Quite.
So, and this is something. I mean, the idea of the sort of how the world should be. I'm absolutely fascinated by the fact that none of you really see so much of a great threat. So let's turn to the internal struggles. Constantine, you talked about our civilization is better, and you made the point again. We're having this debate here in a university, and presumably the very reason for having the discussion is the West in decline, because everybody accepts that they want these values. Why do you fear the threat to that, like an internal threat? How great do you think that threat is?
Well, first of all, to address your question about external, internal threats, I don't see them as in any way separate. It doesn't matter what level of external threats you face. If you are stronger than them internally, you're going to be fine. All of that is ultimately based on whether you are capable, strong enough, confident enough, united enough, etc., to defend yourself against whatever is coming from the outside. It's always, these two things cannot be separated from each other. So the West losing its confidence, losing its ability to articulate its own values with confidence, losing its unitedness, using its identity in many ways, is a threat because it makes us more vulnerable to external challenge. Now, because I've been talking for so long, I've forgotten the second question that you asked.
Well, can I interrupt for just a second?
Of course.
Because I want to push you just a little bit on this confidence with which you assert the preference for a set of values that have never been applied universally internally, right? So is the solution then to, like, this internal disruption around who gets access to those, to liberty, to freedom, to universal, whatever it is, whatever value, I mean, you could name the values, whose free speech is challenged more than others, right? How do you justify, like, do you just paper that over?
I don't paper it over. What I say to that is a phrase that I wish more people used, that we use in Russia, which is everything is understood in comparison. Nobody is saying that the Western world is perfect. There are books and academics' careers and all sorts of accolades that can be achieved by chronicling, as Yanis very articulately did, about the evils of the West and its history. You can do that forever, because every great civilization in history has committed things that we, by our standards today, consider evil, and in fact, will be hypocritical in its own time too. But the question is, what is a better set of values? Does one exist? Now, to answer your question about, what you're alluding to, there is a phrase in America that I think answers your question very well: a more perfect union. No one suggests that the United States or the values of Western Europe are perfect. I would not suggest that even to this day, all people in America are treated equally, whether that's on sex or race or whatever line. But which country has made more progress? We talk endlessly in the West about racism. Okay, what other great civilizations in the world are better at race relations than we are? Is it Russia? When I was last in Russia, there was a song playing on the metro, which was, "They killed a Negro, la 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 la, he can't play basketball anymore." In China, one of the most popular commercials on TV was a Chinese girl who was approached by a black man. She pours him off and shoves him into a washing machine. She puts the product that is being advertised into the washing machine. And what's the payoff? He comes out Chinese. Where is this great world to which we are comparing ourselves to? You cannot compare our civilization to utopia. You have to compare it to reality. And in reality, we are the best civilization in existence today. And that is why we must maintain our dominance around the world.
And no one seems to be arguing with that. Are we good enough?
I don't agree with that at all.
Okay.
Lots of people are arguing
We'll come
with that.
back to that. But are we good enough? I just want to...
We're never going to be good enough. Are you good enough? Are you good? Am I good enough as a human being? Have I worked out the right way to treat my wife or my son so that I could say, I no longer need to improve. I am this perfect person.
Okay.
Is there any human being in the world who's not a psychopath who can make that claim? No. So why should we expect our civilization to be perfect? We should only expect it to be as perfect as it can possibly be, and better than others. That's all that there is. Only comparison and nothing else. And if you're comparing us to the land of milk and honey, you are dangerous.
Okay, but I would agree there's a third thing. It's not just accepting that we're not perfect and that we're better than others, but actually actively working to improve the internal, which I'm not hearing you advocate for.
Well, you haven't asked me about it. I'm very happy to advocate it. We had this discussion, very briefly, we had this discussion over dinner last night about diversity and inclusion and all of these programs which are intended to bring people into the thing. And I say to all of that, the right objective, difficult as it is to achieve in any society, is that there should be zero discrimination against people. And what we have today in the modern West is a new framework of discrimination. We have decided that it is okay to discriminate against white people. It's okay to discriminate. Oh, you laugh. Well, let me give you some statistics. Fantastic, I enjoy that.
Well, before you give us some statistics.
No, let me give some statistics.
You can come back
if you are Jewish or Asian or white, it is much harder for you to get into an American university because all of those groups are widely discriminated against in that society.
That's simply untrue.
That is factually correct.
That is simply untrue.
For the same SAT score, you are much less likely to get in. The BBC has whole realms of jobs that are not available to white people. There are internships that prohibit white people from applying. Now, I don't regard myself as white. I'm a first-generation Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, Jewish immigrant. I hate this stuff, and I hate it because it unfairly privileges people who do not deserve the privilege. What we should be doing is eliminating discrimination, not introducing new types of discrimination.
Cynthia.
I think when you're born on first base and everybody else is trying to come up behind you. I was not born on first base. You already are.
How?
As a man. As a man compared to half of the population. You have advantages that are undeniable.
Really?
They are. And you already are ahead of the curve in applications to things, in the way that resumes are reviewed. And so, and you have a privilege of walking around in the world being perceived as white, even if you don't perceive yourself that way, in terms of how you're treated.
I was literally called a Paki at school.
Okay.
How am I perceived as white?
Well, it depends on where you are in the world.
Right. So in my country, I was name-called and discriminated against for being brown. So I have a privilege. You've decided by looking at me that I have privilege?
We all have privilege on this panel. Everyone does. Everyone carries bits of it, right? I'm just saying, and I'm not saying that there aren't differences in admissions. I mean,
there are.
But those differences are also coming on the heels of widespread, well-acknowledged data that SAT scores are also biased, that people live in really different racially segregated neighborhoods with different school experiences, where 15% of the kids in Washington, D.C. are unhoused, right, in the public school system.
So why don't we fix that instead of...
Exactly.
Well, I'm fully in favor of that, of course. What we should be doing is giving people an equal opportunity to succeed. What we're now doing is not giving people an opportunity to succeed and then saying, oh, you're black, let's give you a leg up into university. That doesn't work.
It's not a leg up. It's an acknowledgement that there are differences in the experiences of kids who grow up, let's say, in poverty. That from certain school districts, from certain... So I think that there's... Yes, so invest the energy there rather than at the other.
Can I just create a little bit of space for Constantine to set out what the consequences of this mind virus, well, actually the mind virus you applied to people thinking this, but the consequences of the discrimination that you see in place?
Well, it's the end of meritocracy. It's the end of meritocracy.
It never started. Meritocracy never begun to end. There's never been meritocracy.
Okay, let me rephrase for the pedants.
Privilege.
Let me rephrase for the pedants.
And
it's the end of the pursuit of meritocracy as the goal. No. I agree with Cynthia. The United States Constitution, as written in its original format...
Positive discrimination is an attempt to create meritocracy.
A failed attempt, an attempt that promotes people who are not qualified.
But not trying is even more of a failure.
I did not say we should not try. I repeat for the third time.
Can I come in
it's
as
difficult to talk when you
interrupt
me every 3 words. I did not say we should not try. I think you heard me say twice now that we should be seeking to eliminate discrimination. Mm-hmm. I think I heard myself say that. So the problem with this agenda is that it ends the pursuit of meritocracy as the singular goal for which we should be striving, and instead reintroduces a new form of discrimination that advantages people not for their talents, not for their drive, not for their passion, but for the fact that they have a certain skin color, a certain set of genitals, or whatever else. It is completely antithetical to the goals of the West.
Right.
Spectacularly
before you come in, I just want to ask one question so that we can narrow it down. Do you accept that in some environments, because just the nature of people responding to people who look or act like them, you end up with these sort of fairly, and it could be entirely black, it could be entirely white, it could be entirely gay. Do you recognize that there is a need to almost kickstart the process so that you have a more diverse and fair group that's doing the picking? You don't even accept that?
Absolutely not. I don't think
under no circumstances.
I don't think there is any need to kickstart things. What there is a need to do is to make sure that people are not discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their sex or their sexuality. Okay, that's the need.
And if it's an entirely, let's use the historical example, well, it might be white male group or it could be black women doing the employment, and there is a record that they tend to employ like them, you don't think that some external force shoving them in a different direction should be brought in?
This is where meritocracy comes in. I am an employer. I run a YouTube channel which employs 10 people. It would never in a million years occur to me to employ somebody because of the color of their skin or their sex, because I know that the only thing that matters is getting the very best person for that job. The very best person. And by the way, just so you know, we hired a woman to run the whole thing and she fired all the other women. So there you go.
Yanis.
I'd like to make a couple of points. One concerns this. Look, as an educator, many a time, in a class, there would be young people who, because of their disadvantaged background, needed more of my attention. Okay? Because of their disadvantaged background, they didn't have the same tools that other kids did. Now, I gave them more attention, which meant, because it's a zero-sum game, there are a fixed number of hours every day, that attention, extra attention, I didn't give to other kids that were advantaged or coming from the advantage. To call this discrimination, because I didn't make my time available equally to everyone, is to miss out on the fact that in order to bring about meritocracy, in order to bring out the talents of the disadvantaged kids, and of course, disadvantage is highly correlated with gender, with races, race, with ethnic background. To call this discriminatory in the pursuit of meritocracy is essentially to fly in the face of the facts. The second point I wanted to make...
very briefly, I did not.
Okay, you can come
I did not call that discrimination. I was talking about admission. No,
when
I was talking about
in
admissions.
Universities that we are going to take people from a working class,
I was
and therefore
talking about admissions.
Okay,
admissions.
but I needed to make the second point because I think it's a question. It touches upon. It speaks to perhaps the deepest difference between Constantine and I. We have one commonality. We both grew up in a dictatorship. But a very different kind of dictatorship. He grew up in the Soviet Union. I grew up in a Greek fascist dictatorship under NATO. And I'm saying this because you have a tendency to think in terms of us, the West, versus them. And them being the East, being the uncivilized Chinese, or the homicidal Russians, or the Africans, or who are trying to, to come to our shores. Because of my background, I have a very different tendency. You see, we were in Greece, when I was growing up, part of the West. We were part of the Council of Europe. We were part of NATO. And yet, the secret police broke down our door and abducted my father, and we lived in terror of a fascist dictatorship. So I know how to not see the world in us versus them. I can see, interestingly, my father, the same father, when the dictatorship fell, instructed me in no uncertain terms that I should study in Britain so that I wouldn't have to face the secret police. So I can relate to the importance and cherish the importance of Western values, while at the same time recognizing the dialectical relationship. It is the terror that the West has unleashed on so many other societies that has created existentialist threats for the United States, for us. So let us, just for a moment, consider the possibility that this us versus them, the West versus the rest, is the root problem which essentially condemns the West to the decline of the values, which may end up with a bang, not a whimper.
Well, I apologize. Clearly, tonight I'm speaking very unclearly because everything I'm saying is being misheard and misrepresented. I never for one time said that the rest of the world was uncivilized. I never said that the Chinese were uncivilized. The Chinese civilization is one of the most ancient civilizations in human history. The Indian civilization is one of the most ancient civilizations in human history. The idea that I think Russia...
You said that our civilization is better.
It is better.
Don't mince your words now.
I am not mixing my words now. I'm
Hold on a second.
Explaining to you exactly what I meant.
Our civilization is better.
No, it's not.
Well, quite. So...
It really is not. The Arab civilization saved us from the Middle Ages through the translation process. We wouldn't have the ancient Greeks. We wouldn't have the Renaissance without the Arab civilization.
But did I ever say...
the Jews lived far better lives in the Ottoman Empire than they did in the West.
We're talking 2024. Where would you choose to be born today?
In the southern suburbs of Athens, where I come from, because I'm a patriot.
Yeah, I would still be in the United States.
There you go.
Somewhere in the West, I haven't picked where yet. I'm waiting to see which part of it declines faster. But the point I'm trying to make is when I talk about our civilization being better, it's a comparative analysis, not chauvinism. I come from a different society. I don't see Russians as others. I see myself as Russian, and my values to some extent are still from that place, and I borrow from that, and I borrow also from my Western heritage by virtue of my growing up and being educated here. The point I'm trying to make is we have to compare to others. And I say to you, I would much rather live in a world where the West is dominant than the alternative. Now, what is the alternative? Many people who will tell you, well, the West is hypocritical. Yes, it is. The West has an evil history. Yes, it has. They will then not articulate what it is that they're looking forward to. And my argument is the multipolar world, which is being so prominently advertised to you as the end of our hypocrisy and the end of our evilness and the solution to all the terrible things that we have done, is an unstable structure which will result in the dominance of a different civilization, which will impose its values on the world. And the question that we should all be asking ourselves is, do we want that? Or do we want the West to continue to be the dominant force in the world? That is the choice. And anyone who tells you otherwise is either misleading you unintentionally or doing so deliberately.
Okay. We keep coming back to that point, and I suspect we will do so again, but I'm going to drag you both back to the point we were discussing earlier about, well, the striving for a meritocracy and what you do about it. And Cynthia, because you, I think it's fairly clear you disagree with where Constantine stands on this, but you have also researched that those beliefs are a problem, or at least they are, I shouldn't say, they are widely held, and I know that you would say that needs addressing.
Well, I think one of the problems with Constantine's view is that it's really boring to live in a world where, like, I don't want to be a teacher in a classroom where everyone is exactly the same, where you have a full classroom of all people who've gone to the same
Before Constantine interrupts, he doesn't want to either, I don't think.
But what I'm saying is...
I'm just...
Right. But what I'm saying is that's without attending to the different lenses that people bring. I'm not saying only by race. I want veterans in my classroom, right? I want ideological diversity in my classroom. I want as many different lenses as possible so that we have the most interesting and robust discussions, which is what we're doing right here. And I think if you're only using criteria for admission or for selection that have privileged, I know you hate that word, privileged certain kinds of perspectives, the experiences of those who live in wealthier school districts, I tell you, what you end up with is a classroom, in my case, full of white men from Fairfield, Connecticut, from the best public school district. That's the most boring thing I could imagine doing as a teacher.
Okay, but if you have a student, you're, for the sake of argument, young, white, male student, and you have better grades than someone else, and they get the place because it's contextualized, would you feel that that was unfair?
I don't think that it's set up that way. I don't think we don't have just like 6 measures and then there's a ranking system the way there is when you apply to the National Science Foundation or something for funding. It should be more holistic. We admit athletes at huge rates. We recruit athletes. We give privilege to the students of faculty, the children of faculty and staff, right? We give legacy admissions to those who are, because we think they're going to be more donors to the university, right? There are many different types of affirmative action, and now affirmative action based on race is prohibited anyway. So, we're not doing that anymore, and so you have to find a holistic way of it. I'm so glad I'm not an admissions counselor, but I want kids from farms in Oregon in my classroom too, right? And so they have to figure out ways to holistically admit.
And what do you see at the moment? How far away from a meritocracy is the part of the US that you live in at the moment?
I mean, it's absurd. There's no meritocracy right now. There are people who can take advantage of opportunities, and there are people who just are never going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities because they're born into, unhoused situations, food insecurity, living. I mean, the cost of living, right? Of even paying for groceries. How do you get to pay for the SAT courses and the private tutoring?
Can I respond to what Constantine's point was? Address the housing.
Absolutely.
Address the poverty.
We can agree on that, 100%.
Yeah, but you need to go against the real estate sector.
But what do you do in the meantime?
You need to go
against the real estate sector and Wall Street.
Yeah, so you need a temporary solution.
Who insist on
in the
private
meantime.
housing, which is the reason why housing is so expensive.
I agree. But I was very reassured to hear Cynthia talk about her great interest in ideological diversity in the university, because that is one thing that really doesn't exist very much in Western universities today. She described this as a conspiracy theory during her opening remarks. Jonathan Haidt, who's by no means an evil right-winger, has written extensively about this in a number of his works. There was a time, not that long ago, when the ratio of left to right on university campuses in terms of faculty was about 1 to 2. In some social media departments, not social media, sorry, in some social studies and various other social science departments in Western universities today, it's 1 to 100. There is no ideological diversity, for the most part, in Western universities.
And in business schools is exactly the opposite.
Yes, but business schools are a very tiny minority of the people that we produce. Yes,
they are the ones who produce the rulers of the universe.
No, they're the ones that produce the business people. It's not the same thing.
The rulers of the universe.
Right. But when we're talking about academia, which is what I was talking about in my remarks, the fact is there is no ideological diversity there whatsoever. And there has been no pursuit of it. And we saw that with what happened to the 3 major universities in America in the wake of October 7th and the testimony that people like Claudine gave.
Like you mean there were people who were opposed to genocide?
No, there were people who were supportive of genocide. There were people like Claudine Gay who refused to say that the genocide of Jews is something that is not covered by the free speech protections, which they applied to nobody else.
There were war crimes by Hamas, but after the 7th of October, there is a wholesale genocide against the people of Palestine.
Well, let's not... Right.
War crimes by Hamas, genocide by Israel.
I have no wish to get into the Israel-Palestine issue. I would have a lot more sympathy with the people who claim the defense of free speech for their arguments if they hadn't spent the previous decade firing academics for expressing the wrong opinion, punishing students who dressed up in the wrong costume for Halloween, and doing things of that nature.
Well, let me agree with you for just a second.
Oh, please.
Because I got involved in student politics before you were born, mostly, 1978. And I was always against the no-platform agenda of the left. So there, just a moment, I'm just throwing a bridge.
I've got a feeling now you're going to move on. Okay,
I also believe in boisterous debate and not banning anyone from getting up on a stage.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. While we've landed on this subject, I must just introduce a question. And they phrase it like this. With our allies like Israel and Turkey blatantly violating international law with their attacks on Syria, Turkey's illegal occupation of northern Iraq, and Israel's various crimes on the Palestinian people, their words, that is, do the West still have a moral leg to stand on when confronting enemies like Russia, China, and Iran? And I wonder, my question, that question is, do they have a moral leg to stand on? But I'm wondering how you feel what we're seeing playing out in the Middle East and the West's reaction to it is going to ultimately affect the West. Yanis.
There is a genocide happening in Gaza. There was ethnic cleansing before that. There have been war crimes against Israeli Jews. I personally consider this to be the makings of the West. The idea that we would going to solve the centuries of European complicity in anti-Semitism, in pogroms, culminating in the Holocaust, by declaring Palestine to be a land without a people, just like the British declared Australia to be a land without a people. We are the culprits. We, the West, are the culprits for everything that has been happening there. As for the image of the West, there is no such thing. It's in tatters. We are such hypocrites. When Putin bombards a theater or a hospital in Mariupol, rightly, the West considers this to be a war crime. And he's indicted by the International Criminal Court, and everybody in the West says they will be arrested. When Netanyahu's government pulverizes every hospital, every university, every mosque, every archaeological site, and continues to defy the International Court of Justice, defies the International Criminal Court, the West says, oh, well, we cannot do anything about that because he's our bastard.
Okay, but Israel...
Therefore, the West has decided to destroy its own credibility.
Of course, Israel would say, we would stop this tomorrow, just release the hostages.
And do what? Continue the ethnic cleansing that they started in 1948?
Okay,
what about the West
Bank? But you take my point.
No, I don't take your point. It is a pathetic point. There is something called international law. You are not allowed wantonly to kill civilians, to target them, to have the "where's your daddy" application, which makes sure that when there is a Hamas operative, they have to wait until they go home to blow up the whole family to smithereens. These are war crimes, they're crimes against humanity, it's a genocide, and for the West to be providing the bombs for that to happen, and not to intervene to stop it, simply by withdrawing military support for 24 hours, the West is culpable.
I don't know if either of you want to come in on this, not least perhaps on ultimately what it will mean for Israel.
I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I will say I agree with Yanis, and I think that for me, the bigger issue, not the bigger issue globally for the West, but the issue that we spend the most time on in our lab is what's happened on the anti-Semitism from the left, and that's something that I think we've seen across the board on our college campuses and elsewhere, that the repercussions for how hate gets expressed and how people get demonized for their religious and racial identity based on what's happening in another part of the world are off the charts right now. And so I think that's another type of problem that emerges, and that's sort of where I spend my time thinking about it, but I think you're not wrong.
I want to give Yanis an opportunity to have a go at Cynthia for a change. You were smiling there.
No, I agree.
No, oh, you agree with her. Fantastic.
Okay, but
well,
Constantine,
let me be
does not necessarily mean disapproval, you know.
Okay. Let me be the voice of disagreement then. So, boy, where do we begin? I don't particularly want to open up the entire Israel conversation tonight, but
neither do I, can I tell you?
Yeah.
Fine, but I probably will anyway.
We knew.
So there's a few things to say as a preamble. First of all, war crimes, whoever they're committed by, are to be condemned and should be investigated and dealt with. That is, my heart bleeds for the people of Ukraine. I've been very openly supportive of their struggle for their independence. But if war crimes have been committed by Ukrainian forces, they should be investigated in the same way that crimes committed by Russia are. The same is true of Israel and Gaza. However, the entire thing that sits underneath our discussion, that underpins it all, which is what I was talking about in my remarks, the failure to understand things in comparison, the failure to understand trade-offs, the failure to reckon with the reality of life and the reality of war, is the reason that in my country, in the UK, Winston Churchill is now being revised. His history and contribution to... This is important because I'm coming to Israel. We are being told that, say, the bombings of Germany, which occurred at the end of World War II, were not only unnecessary, they were a war crime for which Churchill is singularly responsible, and he is to be demonized for that. We are told that the bombings of Japan, which they were not necessary or, in fact, advised, they were also war crimes. This is a complete misunderstanding of history and war. Both the bombings of Germany and the dropping of the 2 bombs in Japan were completely necessary, saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
Let's not introduce another conflict to this. We're not going back to the Second World War. We were fleetingly going via
your
the Middle
BBC
East.
background is affecting this, because sometimes it takes time to say things, right? And to make comparison and analysis. The reason that those things are happening, the reason we're being told that our actions in World War II were illegitimate, the reason we're being told that what happened in Japan was illegitimate, is so that we can now say that what is happening in Israel is genocide, as opposed to saying the truth, which is my family in Ukraine are hiding in bunkers and in tunnels and in tube stations, and that is why they're safe. The reason that the people of Gaza are not safe is that the tunnels that Hamas created underneath the entirety of Gaza are not being used to house civilians.
Constantine, I can't bear to listen to
not
this.
Only
there are thousands of children today that are maimed, they have no parents, they live in rubble.
You're right.
They haven't eaten for 3 days.
You're right.
And to just listen to you here without protesting, and I'm sorry, Sarah, for that.
It's fine.
May I finish and then you can protest?
Precisely
May I finish and then you can protest?
My concept of
May I finish
basic
and then you can
moral
protest?
standards.
May I finish first and then you can protest afterwards? That's usually how it's done.
But let's do it briefly.
I am getting to the point. The reason that all of this is happening is so that people can say that what Israel is doing is genocide. And the reason that they're saying
Or maybe we're saying it because they're doing it.
Wait, no, you've made your point. We are moving on from this within 30 seconds.
We are. The reason they're saying this is that so they can pretend that war is genocide, so that they can delegitimize a country that is defending itself, as you rightly said, in order to secure the return of its hostages, and rightly to do what we did to Hitler and to do what we did to Imperial Japan, which is eliminate the threat to the survival of our
You
society.
are eliminating every member of the population of Gaza.
Which is, by the way, exactly
and
what
the people
happened
you
in
support,
Germany.
you are complicit
I'm complicit in nothing.
placing the whole of the Gazan population on death row.
So
this is the definition of genocide. It is not an attempt to say that there is a genocide.
Yanis, this is related.
I'm sorry, but there are limits. There are limits, and they have been exceeded.
This is relevant.
Yeah.
There was a question. You've taken a stance against the culture of racism accusations that have stifled free discourse. In recent years, growing factions of the America First movement have taken an anti-Israel stance, criticizing the lobby. Their central critique is Israel is a foreign country, receive billions, drag us into wars, lobby for the restriction of so-called anti-Semitism. Should one be able to say this without being faced with aggressive racism accusations?
Should one be able to say that Israel has excessive power in America? Is that what you're saying?
Israel's, well, there's an awful lot they're dragging in, which slightly scare me that we might go down a rabbit hole, but they lobby for the restriction of so-called anti-Semitic hate speech. So it's the idea that,
people should be able to speak freely. I am the #1 critic in the world, I think, of that fringe of the American right, who I see in many ways mimicking the excesses of woke leftists and using many of the same tactics.
Okay.
And experience plenty of racism in exchange, but I defend their right to say the things that they say.
Good. At which point, let's move on to something that I cannot believe it has taken this long to bring up, and which I'm sure you're all going to be united in discussing.
Okay.
The arrival of President Trump too. Now, you set out the argument about debt, which is who's going to want to get rid of this because it's in America's interests. And I was just thinking, but hold on a second.
What did I say?
Well, the US debt, as I understood your argument,
the deficit,
in fact, the deficit building the debt.
Yes, indeed.
So the public debt, okay, that actually it's in the US interest to have...
Not in the US, in the interest of the American rentier class.
Okay.
Not the same thing.
Okay.
The ruling class.
Of the ruling class.
Yep.
But I'm assuming that the president, that applies to the president. So what I'm wondering is, assuming President Trump, and I know we're probably going to have to judge him on his actions, not his words, but when he comes in and introduces tariffs, assuming he does, what that does to your argument?
It's a very interesting question, because effectively you are speaking to you're addressing the kernel of the matter, the great incongruity, the internal contradiction of what Trump is proposing. And this is not me being critical in a political or moral sense of Trump, but there is a logical incongruity in what he's proposing. Because the tariffs he's proposing fall under the heading of the elimination of the trade deficit of the United States, the attempt to rebalance the trade books. Now, there are two issues here. One is, will the tariffs succeed in doing that? Because I don't believe it will. The tariffs are going to have a minuscule effect on new jobs being created in the Midwest and so on. And even if they do, they will push the American dollar up. And therefore, that will undo whatever rebalancing of the global economy he achieves through the tariffs. But then there's the second question, even if he succeeds. If he succeeds in eliminating the trade deficit, then suddenly the tsunami of capital, which I described in my introduction, that goes into Wall Street will cease. Because that tsunami of capital is the flip side of the same coin of the trade deficit. And when that happens, if he succeeds in ending this tsunami of capital coming into Wall Street, two things will happen. The Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq are going to subside, and real estate prices are going to start coming down. Now, the question is, therefore, which is the real constituency of Donald Trump?
Is it the people that voted for him in the Midwest to whom he promised jobs and tariffs and so on? Or is it the real estate sector, his bosom buddies and the financiers? In the end, if he has to choose between the working class and this agglomeration of real estate and financiers, I bet, I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, that he's going to side with his buddies.
Cynthia, are you looking forward to President Trump, Mark II?
I can't wait.
She can't wait. I can see that.
No, I'm not looking forward to it. I mean, but I'm not surprised by it either. So I think it was a very predictable outcome of the last several years of a whole cluster of issues that have led people to not trust, as I said, sources of information, to believe the charismatic promises of someone who says your life is going to get better, I'm going to make grocery prices go down, and challenges what has been, I think, a sort of claustrophobic type of judgment, often from elites on the coasts, of people in the middle of the country who feel disregarded, who feel disrespected, who feel their needs are not met, and then vote against their own self-interest for a candidate who promises them things that are not going to be delivered. But the Democrats didn't do a good job messaging what they could do differently.
Okay, but you have no doubt that they won't be delivered.
There's no way they'll be delivered. No. I mean, he's already said he's not going to reduce grocery prices. I mean, people's lives are unlikely to improve in the ways that they wanted them to improve by voting for him, except people who, like, my taxes will go down, that's for sure, right? People who earn enough money will have lower taxes, but it's not gonna play out that way for the rest of the country. So, I think, I think it's, and the kinds of things that are being promised around mass deportations, what's been unleashed already in Springfield, Ohio, with the abuses directed toward Haitian immigrants after Trump repeatedly said that they're eating the pets. I mean, the absurd kinds of dehumanizing and debasing accusations. I think the kind of vigilantism that we're going to see.
Okay, because there will be people elsewhere thinking, look, he's crude, he's vulgar. What difference does it actually make to individuals in the US?
Well, it legitimizes, I mean, that type of rhetoric legitimizes and normalizes a whole range of hate and of kind of bluster.
Your body,
right?
my choice.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that, a 4,600% increase in your body, my choice, after a white supremacist tweets that out on X in the 24 hours after the election. I mean, the kinds of stories that I've heard from people just in the last week after I appeared on PBS NewsHour talking about this. A college student whose mom told me her butt was grabbed, and when she turned around and looked at him, he said, "We can do that now," right? A 10-year-old in a school who made a Christmas ornament and had to redo it because it said, girls shouldn't have jobs, all girls should be maids, go Trump, or something like that. A 13-year-old in a classroom in a hallway who was told to go put on her handmaid's dress. I mean, that type of unleashing of power over girls' and women's bodies as a celebration of a rejection of reproductive rights being at the helm of this election is undeniable. And we know what that's likely going to mean for domestic and intimate partner violence, for other types of assault, and things that are going to happen. And frankly, Trump's nominees, including a bunch of people you can only really describe as having, at least among their characteristics, a history of being a sex pest, is part of the problem as well.
Okay, where are you on? Where are you on this, Constantine? Do you think he's going to fix the problems or make them worse?
I have no idea. I've really given up making predictions about the future. I think it's a bad idea. But I think the one thing that people miss, I was very fortunate that I get to spend a lot of time in America these days. I was there before the election, during the election, and after the election. And one of the things, this touches on something Cynthia talked about earlier, which is, misinformation and so on, and the lack of faith in mainstream institutions. I'm afraid to say the lack of faith in the legacy media and many institutions is a product of the fact that they've been incredibly dishonest, and they've attempted to wield the power that they have to influence elections in the direction of their preferred candidates. We saw this in 2020 when all big tech companies colluded.
I'm guessing you're talking about the US here.
Yes, of course, but that applies elsewhere too. They colluded together to prevent information about President Biden's son being involved in all sorts of corruption and sexual impropriety and so on. They suppressed that story when the New York Post published it. They prevented it from being shared. And they interfered very directly in that election, and there's evidence to suggest that that may have even influenced the outcome. Now, as for President Trump, as someone who, I attended his so-called Nazi rally as an independent observer, and that's when I really saw the extent to which these lies are so prevalent in our culture.
Sorry, forgive me, but which was the Nazi rally?
The Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, which was so talked about.
Yep.
20% of the audience had these little skull caps that they were wearing, presumably Jewish. There was Israel flags everywhere. Every time anyone said anything about Israel, he got a big cheer. And that's when I realized that we really have no idea to the extent to which we've been deceived about this man. Now, does that mean his economic policies are going to work? I have no idea. But what I can tell you is he must not fail. And the reason I say this is, if he does fail...
In what?
In delivering the things that he promised. In delivering the things that he promised to the American people. And the reason I say it's so important that he doesn't is that the reason that people voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2024, and those of them that voted for him in 2020, is they believe what we've been talking about all night here, which is America is in decline. And in decline in many ways, in economic ways, in cultural ways, in all sorts of other ways. If he fails to turn that around, the people that voted for him 3 times now are going to say, well, look, we gave him the House of Representatives. We gave him the Senate. We gave him the presidency. We gave him a stacked judiciary. We gave him everything. We gave him the podcast election where the power of the mainstream media declined to such a point that Joe Rogan made more of an impact on that election than any media outlet in the world. And yet he was still not able to fix it. And what they're going to say then is, why on earth do we need democracy? He must not fail.
Trump won the first time because of Obama's treachery of the working class. Obama was elected smack in the middle of the financial crisis with a promise to look after the victims of the bankers. And instead, he appoints again Larry Summers and Geithner, the bankers' best mates, with a remit to print 10 trillion on behalf of the bankers, while slapping austerity in the end upon the many. This is why lots of people, non-racist, black people voted for Trump. Trump is a creature of the Obama administration. In the same way that the second time around, it is as if Biden and Kamala Harris were doing their best for Trump to be re-elected. And Paul Krugman, my friend and colleague from the New York Times and from academia, who was, I was aghast at Paul. He was writing these articles in the New York Times, effectively pointing the finger, moralizing finger at the people who were complaining about, the cost of living and saying, you've got no right to complain. The economy has never been good. You've never had it so good. So the Democrats were telling the people who were suffering that they never had it so good. And Trump said, I feel your pain. This is why it was inevitable that he was going to win. Just one more point, if I may, Sarah. The tragedy is that in ways that remind us of Hungary and other illiberal despots in the West, in Western Europe, or in Europe, the tragedy is that in the United States, you have people who genuinely have been betrayed by both political parties. Trump is the latest that has made promises to them, which, and here I come back to what I was saying before, he can only have a chance of delivering if he ditches his loyalty to the real estate and the financial sector, which I don't think he will.
Why not?
Because this is his crowd. He wakes up in the morning, and when the Wall Street goes up, he cheers. When he goes down, he considers it his personal failure. Wall Street must come down. The valuation, it's a crazy valuation. So it's America is not in decline.
So what are you saying?
The working class is in decline. The middle class is in decline. The infrastructure is in decline. If you are part of the oligarchy of the United States, whom we call billionaires, not oligarchs for some reason, you've never had it so good.
It's true, but a lot of those people, and this is why I'm not actually disagreeing with you, but actually just curious to hear your opinion. I know some of those people, the evil oligarchs that you talk about, and most of the ones that came out in support of Trump in this election, which is a lot of them, did so not because they want an extra 10 billion in their pocket on top of the 100
they wanted
billion.
Deregulation, they wanted freedom.
Hold on, Yanis.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not even disagreeing with me, you're interrupting me.
Yeah, and I'm not disagreeing with you.
But what they did do is they share the view that I've just articulated to you about the rest of the American people. They see their country in decline. We interviewed Bill Ackman, for example, and talked about this. Bill Ackman doesn't want more billions for himself. He has plenty of billions, I assure you. He has a tennis court on the top of his office in Manhattan. He's fine. He's doing okay. He doesn't want a second tennis court. What he wants is his country to continue to do the thing that a country is supposed to do. The first job of government is to deliver security for its people. The second is prosperity. And when he looks out at his country, he sees that that is not happening for other people. My experience is that most people massively overestimate how badly the billionaires want more money. A lot of them want their country to be better, just like you do.
Okay, we started just on what it means for the US. What do you think it'll mean for Ukraine?
What I think it will mean for Ukraine is, look, again, I'm going to have to spend a minute laying this out. I am Ukraine's biggest cheerleader. I've raised money for veterans in Ukraine. I've raised money. I believe Ukraine has a right to be an independent country. And my disagreement with the policies of Western governments is that we said to Ukraine, rah, 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 we support your fight. And then we didn't give them the things they needed to win. Now, if we were honest and said to them, we're going to give you this much and go ahead and fight this war, the Ukrainians probably wouldn't have fought the war, right? But we lied to them and forced them to fight on a false promise. I'd rather we actually gave them the tools they needed to secure their country. We didn't do that. As for Donald Trump, what I suspect will happen is he will come in and do what I said on day one. The moment Ukraine was invented, I was on Question Time, which is one of the biggest TV programs in the UK. And I said the inevitable outcome of this is the Ukrainians have to fight, they have to do their best, and then they're going to have to do a deal. This was obviously the case. Ukraine was and the problem is that a lot of Western leaders failed to define the victory conditions. So in their head, victory is like the Ukraine flag flying over the Kremlin, which was never going to happen. That was never going to happen. So what Donald Trump will do is he will come in and do a deal. And it will certainly not be the best deal for Ukraine. Hopefully it will not be the best deal for Russia. Hopefully it will be a deal that respects the interest of Russia, which it has, and respects the interest of Ukraine. And I've always said what those were from day one, which is this. It's very simple. Ukraine fought, and Ukrainian men, including many of my friends, went to war to defend their country's long-term survival. And what they need is long-term survival. They need long-term security. That's not going to look like NATO, but it has to be some kind of demilitarized zone or some kind of peacekeeping force so that this can never happen again. And that's what Donald Trump must do. That's what Donald Trump must do. But I make a prediction. Even if he does this, everyone will scream that he sold out Ukraine. And when they do, final point, when they do, just remember that what they promised you was nothing at all. They promised you victory, which was never going to happen in the first place.
I'm stunned. I agree with every word you said. I do. Wow.
One of the consequences, of course, of what happened in Ukraine is you have countries ramping up their military spending. Now, I want to turn to, because we've got about 15 minutes left, to where you ended, with it's going to end with a bang. And you painted an apocalyptic vision, and I'm thinking, is this metaphorical? Or is he thinking that with a more belligerent world, with ramping up of military. Do you really, what do you mean by that bang?
Well, to begin with, we have a climate catastrophe facing us, and we're not talking about it. The only way of ensuring, the only way of doing our best not to reach the point of no return would be for the United States, for Europe and China to cut a deal that would involve a number of layered decisions regarding production, supply chains, de-escalating conflicts. You know, war is not good for the environment. Let's not forget that. And that deal has fallen victim to the escalation of the new Cold War, which Trump started, but in a small way, and Biden turbocharged. So that's one point, right? That's a bang. You know, if the planet becomes uninhabitable and the West remains dominant until we all perish, or, you know, we go to a Mad Max kind of world, you know, that's not a good outcome. The second point I make is there are two schools of thought in Washington. One is the realist school of Kissinger, who perished, who died, the late Kissinger, Mearsheimer, and Donald Trump, who, as you said, they wanted to end the war in Ukraine. Why? In order to concentrate on a potential escalation with China, possibly a war with China. So both sides, the Democrats and the Trumpist Republicans, agree that it is necessary to escalate the new Cold War, perhaps to a level of a hot war with China. And that will be another version of the bang that I was referring to. It is wholly unnecessary. There is no reason to think that, you know, the big bully will have to clobber over the head the rising bully. This Thucydides trap is a great violation of the memory of Thucydides. I believe in the Oedipus trap that the West is falling prey to. Allow me to explain what it is. You may remember the story of Oedipus' father, who was so worried by the prophecy that his son would kill him, that in the end he was killed by his son. It was a prophecy that made the son kill Oedipus. So in the same way that the prophecy that, oh, if we don't clobber them over the head, they will, and therefore we need to put China in its little box. That prophecy is creating the circumstances for a confrontation which will firstly stop us from doing what needs to be done regarding the environment, and secondly may even bring about the thermonuclear Big Bang.
Okay, so you're not just positing this as on a spectrum, you're putting it pretty central.
I do. You only have to look at the warmongering across the West, the way in which Europe has, you know, accepted the narrative that, you know, China must be contained. Why must China be contained?
Okay,
Why must China be contained?
If China
Have you looked at the map of China? There are, you know, all these dots of US bases around China. China is contained, but this constant push is creating the backlash, which is making China, in the end, dangerous because of the prophecy, what I call the Oedipus trap.
But it's also because of the rise in military spend in China, and there are even
so
reports
what? I'm going to worry about this, Sarah, I'm going to worry about that when I see the first Chinese army base in Tijuana, facing San Diego, or when I see Chinese vessels patrolling up and down between Los Angeles. No, it won't happen. The Chinese are not interested in doing this. They just want to sell us things.
Okay, but and are the West really that hopeless that they could walk into a conflict?
What, is it the first time? Remember Iran? Remember Afghanistan? Remember Libya?
But China?
Well, they can go big this time. They killed 1 million Iraqis as a result of miscalculation. They killed many, many Americans, needlessly. They tried to, they never learned from the British or from the Soviets. They tried to take Afghanistan. They are perfectly capable. In this sense, I trust Trump more than I would trust Kamala Harris, because the one good thing that this poor excuse for human nature has is he doesn't seem to like war. And that I like.
Cynthia, where are you on the threat from China?
I mean, I'm not in disagreement with Yanis. I think,
seriously?
Yeah, not totally. I believe they're trying to sell us a lot of things, right?
So the threat is from the US?
I see the threat as being, fundamentally rooted in how our technology shapes the way we think. And to the extent that, TikTok apps are collecting every piece of information that we have about us,
Google,
right?
You mean.
And
unlike Meta.
Exactly, any apps. But,
remember Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, fair.
Okay.
That would be my concern, right? Is what data gets collected, how easy is it to manipulate? How easy is it to interfere?
Yeah, but TikTok is huge in America.
Yeah.
It
is. And constant discussions about whether it should be banned, right? That's my concern, is like the creation of a world in which we make ourselves vulnerable to manipulation. We make ourselves vulnerable to interference, where the divides, our polarized divides, are actually maybe less than we think. I think actually they're less than we think, Constantine, between you and me. But until we met, I wouldn't have said that, right? Until we met in person, because our online personas and the way that our worlds bump up against each other are designed both by profits, by algorithms, by the way salacious posts get more.
Okay, what did you expect of Constantine before you met him?
Charm and humor, surely.
I definitely thought I would dislike you. And I don't.
See, I'm a great guy, really.
I disagree with you, but I don't dislike you.
What did you think you'd...
I thought I would like you.
And she turned out to be wrong.
Constantine. China? Is it China?
May I dodge that question entirely, because I really try and make a habit of not talking about things I don't understand, and that's one of them. But I think your question that you were asking a little bit earlier, actually about European defense spending in particular, is one that we should talk about, because there are many views on why the war in Ukraine started. And one of the things that human beings have known throughout the ages is something that's encapsulated in the phrase civis pacem parabellum. It's where the name of the parabellum round comes from. If you want peace, prepare for war. One of the reasons that the West finds itself in as many conflicts as it does today, it's that it's signaling weakness and projecting weakness around the world. And I have to agree with Yanis on this, despite my inclination to do otherwise, which is that the thing I really do hope for the Trump presidency is that he instinctively understands this. And he instinctively understands that the way to prevent conflict is to make sure that no one messes with you. And the fact that despite his protestations, Europe failed to live up to its NATO commitments for a very long time is one of the reasons that we are where we are. And by hook or by crook, the war in Ukraine and him and everything else that's been going on has dragged European governments into a position where they're actually doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, which is taking our security seriously. And if they do that, we will be much safer from attack from other places than we are today.
Okay, there were quite a few questions on this, particularly on that. But Yanis, I had been planning to come onto Europe, and we're doing with... To quote back at you, the EU is inept, backward, and irrelevant.
Isn't it? Let's say tomorrow morning we have in New York, in the auspices, in the offices of the United Nations, with Donald Trump leading it, we have an international peace conference for Ukraine. So you have Zelensky, you have Trump, you have Putin, you have Xi, you have Modi, maybe, what's his name, Keir Starmer. Who will represent Europe? Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen doesn't have the legitimacy. Well, we do. You know why? Because we're going to pay for Ukraine. The Americans never pay for the mess that they leave behind, or that is left behind. In the case of the Gulf War, they made the Saudis pay. In the case of the Ukraine war, it will be the European Union. They will need at least $1 trillion to rebuild Ukraine. I'm all in favor of rebuilding Ukraine. The people of Ukraine deserve it. But Europe can't afford it, simply because we have failed to federate our political power and our fiscal power 20 years plus after federating our monetary system. And the result is that Germany cannot balance its books today. We had 15 years of zero investment in German, Northern European industry, forget Greece, but the basket case. So the result is we missed out on a whole industrial revolution vis-à-vis China and the United States. And now we are in a long-term secular slump. This is not a little recession that will be, the German industrial model is kaput, it's finished. It cannot be replenished. It's a bit like, you remember those beautiful Olivetti electric typewriters of the late 70s, okay? Well, the PC would kill them. And no reduction in wages or government grants would save the Olivetti typewriters. That's the state of European industry today.
There was one question which, I mean, it's certainly not global, but it's from a Norwegian point of view, which I have to ask. The Norwegian krona has, over a long period of time, there's been a fairly steady decline. And the question was saying, will they ultimately have to join the euro?
Don't do it. Don't do it. If the European Union truly wanted to bring Russia down, they would have allowed it to enter the Eurozone.
Perhaps we should try it.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left. We haven't really talked about solutions, and I know you're going to sum up, but I think we should just, you can keep whatever you want to say for your few minutes summing up, but if there was something that you would say, because I know you say it's not in decline, but you have a sort of definition of decline that's slow, and then you say...
It's of power. There's no decline in power.
But it's to do with values, which is surely so important. So what would you do? What would you say would address that or redress that?
Well, a number of things, but if you want to talk at the European level, we should have federated or break up the euro at the level of Europe. One or the other. The middle course doesn't work. It will bring stagnation forever for Europe. Yeah? I'm a federalist. I would like to see Europe federated. Since we created the federal money, the euro, because dismantling it is going to be quite destructive. Alternatively, we should have a time machine and go back and not have created the euro. At the level of global financial flows and, regarding the analysis that I gave you of this lopsided surplus recycling mechanism, which is creating the problems that the United States now has, the divisions, the inequalities, and so on. The answer was very presciently put forward by John Maynard Keynes in the Bretton Woods Conference. His idea, which we can adapt and develop. Imagine that we had a system whereby all international trade and capital flows were to be denominated in a common accounting unit, not a common currency, a common accounting unit. Keynes referred to it as a banker. We could call it the cosmos, whatever. And imagine that we had, the books of the IMF, of the International Monetary Fund, displaying in real time the balance of trade and capital flows for every country with every other country. And imagine that we had a simple rule that symmetrically adds a levy, essentially taxing equally and symmetrically surpluses and deficits. And that money accumulated in a common fund to be invested in green technologies and so on in the poorer countries. Now, that would be a genuine multipolar alternative to an international monetary fund, which is now operating like the bailiffs of the Wall Street bankers.
Okay.
We don't have much time. I could give you another 3 or 4 examples.
Okay. Please don't.
Okay.
Well, you can have them in your summing up. Just briefly, because I think we should do a vote in the room as well on this.
Briefly on solutions?
Yeah, is there one thing?
I mean, I would say 2 things. I'll do it quickly. I think we have to see investments in the social well-being of communities across the world. I mean, if we want people to stay where they are and thrive, if you want people to be able to support their families, feel safe and secure, then you have to make those investments. Otherwise, they're going to have very real and legitimate grievances that drive them to be more vulnerable to the kinds of propaganda, disinformation that we've seen undermining democracy. So that's one thing. And the second thing is some of those investments have to be in specific media and digital literacy that makes people more skeptical of that content. We'll come back to that.
You'll come back to that. Constantine, just a thought on the sort of solutions?
Well, I mentioned it at the very end of my remarks. The reason that people from across every strata of American society are enthusiastic as they are today is, rightly or wrongly, they believe that the next 4 years signals an opportunity for business expansion, for wealth creation, for the creation of jobs and so on. And one thing that we have been terrible at, I mean, our deficits are so large, whole new fields of economics have been invented to justify them, right? But in borrowing all that money and printing all that money, the one thing that we've spent very little time doing is thinking about how we're going to build wealth rather than imagine it from thin air and create it in reality. And that's why a lot of business people in America are very excited. That's why Trump was able to put together the team that he put together. Because there is a hope that we can unleash the talents and creativity of, in their case, the people of America. We need to find a way to do this here. We have to have a vision of how we succeed. If all we talk about is how do we cut up this pie to make sure that it's fair, we're going to stop keeping an eye on the things that matter, which is how do we bake the pie.
Okay. Now, I'm going to do a vote of the room, which is going to be a little bit strange because, I know Yanis was a little bit, we're not in decline, but they were all arguing that, yes, we are in decline largely, but you were also fairly optimistic about a number of things. So I want to just see, anybody, I don't know what your position was at the beginning, but would you raise your hand if you think the West is in decline? Before you do so, I'm going to do the opposite of that in a minute, so to weed out those of you who can't be bothered to put your hand up. So, is the West in decline? Could you lower your hand? Is the West not in decline? Okay, for those of us who aren't in the room, I would say it was about, what, 10% don't think it's in decline?
I'm used to being in the minority of one. I don't mind.
So it's maybe 1 to 10, and maybe a bit more than that, actually. So it's obviously overwhelming majority think that there is an element of decline, of course, the scale of that. Thank you all very much. We must turn now to your summing up. You each have a few minutes before we close off the debate, and we're going to start with you, Yanis.
All right. The prospect of humanity depends on not going down Constantine's way of maintaining a unipolar world. A unipolar world is toxic. It is quick marching us to extinction for two reasons. One I mentioned already, but I'll mention it once more because we didn't discuss it sufficiently. I kept bringing it back, but it was disappearing. One is, of course, climate emergency, the climate disaster. Without a genuinely multipolar, democratic humanity, where the Indians are represented, the Chinese are represented, the Africans are represented, the Europeans are represented, there is no way we're going to survive on this planet. Donald Trump, Constantine was arguing in favor of a unipolar West. Well, there's no such thing as Britain, even if they have a place in the Security Council. It is the United States. And you have a president who doesn't believe in climate change. He thinks it's hocus pocus. So, it is clear to me, I don't need to elaborate the point, that humanity's future depends on a multipolar world in which there is more proportionality between numbers, prospects, and power. The second point, Constantine, and I'm referring to you because this has been the tussle tonight, and I've very much enjoyed it, and thank you so much for providing me with incredible joy.
He's speaking after you, and you're not interrupting.
I remember in 2001 demonstrating outside Russia's embassy in London against Putin. And I remember a month later, I was in the Senate of the University of Athens, and I was the only one, again, I was in the minority of one. The proposal that had come to the Senate was the proposal to award a certain Vladimir Putin an honorary doctorate, and I was the only one who voted against, and I explained my negative vote by saying that he's a war criminal. because of what he did, effectively killed 250,000 people in Chechnya just in order to solidify his regime. And what was the reaction of the British police outside the Russian embassy and of the West? They treated us, who were opposing Putin, as the enemies of the people, as the enemies of the West. That is the West for you. In a sense, Putin would not have existed if it wasn't for the massive diminution of the life prospects of Russians for which the United States was chiefly responsible through the IMF in 1993, 1994. There was a government back then, corrupt, incompetent and so on, but they just wanted to become part of the West in Russia. And, the crushing of the prospects of the Russian people was the result of the West. This is why I'm saying, stop thinking in terms of the good West, the bad East. We are the ones, because we have such exorbitant power, that we are creating malignancies in Russia, in China, in Syria, in Israel, through our nasty and rather short-sighted policies.
Constantine, the floor is yours for a few minutes.
Well, before I get stuck into Yanis, let me make a few observations, or one rather, that I think ought to be made. One of the things I've really enjoyed about tonight is we've been able to discuss our ideas openly. And the two great civilizations that are the alternative to ours do not allow this in their countries, or would not allow this in the wonderful multipolar world, which would inevitably result in one of them being in charge. So the fact that we have the freedom to speak and to exchange ideas is quite special and unique, and we ought not to forget that in itself as we have this conversation. And that brings me back to Solzhenitsyn and what he said about courage. In the UK today, as I alluded to in my remarks, we have police officers coming to the doors of journalists to investigate them for things that they tweeted, for things that they said. We're going in the wrong direction. Instead of having courage to speak our minds and to disagree robustly as we have tonight, we are increasingly screwing tighter the lid of the pressure cooker. If we do not allow people to express their legitimate concerns, we will create terrible outcomes within our own societies and for the world in general. The freedom to speak and to express ideas, even though sometimes it's going to be wrong, even though sometimes it's going to lead to misinformation, is an incredibly important part of our society. Now, I agree with Cynthia. I think the social media age creates perverse incentives for communication, undoubtedly. I agree with Cynthia, by the way, even as someone who has a large YouTube channel and podcast, that while we are right to criticize the legacy media, we are right to call out their lies, we're right to highlight the fact that very often fact-checking and misinformation is simply used as a way to advance their particular ideological viewpoint under the guise of objectivity. Nonetheless, those of us in the new media are not held to the same standards, and therefore it's much easier for us. We do need a mainstream media, we do need mainstream institutions, but they have to be better than they've been. And that's where the future of the Western world is going to be negotiated, because the levels of trust that most Westerners now have in journalism, in academia, and in other mainstream institutions are so low that they're lower than politicians, and that is low. Until we address that crisis through each media outlet rejecting the ability to abuse the power that it has, we will not resolve this issue. So there are many aspects to everything we've been discussing tonight, but the thing that I would call for is the courage to speak freely the things that we believe and to hear truth when it is being spoken in front of you. Thank you.
You know, 7 or 8 years ago, about a mile from my house, there's a pizza shop called Comet Pizza, and some of you may have heard about this guy who showed up armed with an AK-47 and tried to storm in and rescue what he thought were trafficked children in the basement, who he believed Democrats were holding in order to harvest their adrenochrome and secure more power for themselves. And it's a pizza shop that doesn't even have a basement, but that was the beginnings of the alarm bells about QAnon in the US, which we have since exported to, I think, some 40 countries in ways that have inspired violence, including the storming of the German parliament and other types of attacks on government officials, and kidnappings of children as well. And so it's just an example of what happens when you let a kind of unfettered information ecosystem not have both the kinds of good actor challenges I think that you're referring to, which I completely agree with you on. As long as we all can agree that these are good actors, what happens when they're bad actors doing it? What happens when there are people exploiting it, from whether foreign governments or extremists, in the case of the folks that I study? You need better tools to equip people with ways to be skeptical of the media they consume, to make better informed choices, and to understand where to get accurate, shared knowledge. And right now we lack all of those things. And I think that's where we're going to see the downfall of the West, if we cannot get to a place where, including significant ideological disagreement exists, but there's some idea of where to get that information, where to get competing views of information, where to get expertise, and who can hold it, who can train people in it. Because I think otherwise where we are is people just constantly being willing to and able to go down rabbit holes. And I'll just leave you with the piece of good information that I promised you, which is that we've been testing all kinds of ways with short-form media and tools to equip people with ways to be more skeptical of the media they consume. And it works, right? Is it scalable is another question, but you can actually, if you get to people before they believe it, you can equip them with tools to be more skeptical and look for more information. But education alone isn't enough. So the last anecdote I'll leave you with is my favorite one from our data, which is that everybody gets better in our studies of parents, everybody gets better at recognizing online misinformation, except, for example, through our interventions, except for one group of parents, which is the most highly educated group of parents. They get worse. And you know why? Because they come into the study so much more confident than everyone else that they can already do it. Then they realize this, sometimes propaganda misinformation that their kids encounter is really tricky. It happens in an in-game chat in a game, in a video game, or in an app that's hidden behind a calculator, right? They learn other things and they get less confidence. And sometimes I think that reducing the confidence is part of what we need. So I'll leave you with that.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all in the hall for being here for this debate. Thank anyone at home who's watching. And can I ask you all to thank Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, Constantine Kisin, Yanis Varoufakis.
And Sarah Montague.